On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Within hours, a suspect was arrested. Within days, an official investigation was launched. Within months, a definitive conclusion was announced. Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Yet more than 60 years later, the American public remains unconvinced. Polls consistently show that a majority of Americans believe the official story is incomplete, that crucial information has been withheld, and that the truth about what happened in Dealey Plaza that afternoon remains hidden. The Kennedy assassination is one of the most investigated events in modern history. Researchers have examined thousands of documents, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, and analyzed physical evidence with technology that didn't exist in 1963. The Warren Commission produced a 26-volume report. The House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the case in the 1970s. Declassified documents have revealed that government agencies withheld information from investigators. Yet despite all this investigation, despite all this evidence, the fundamental questions persist. Who actually killed President Kennedy? Was Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone, or was he part of a larger conspiracy? If there was a conspiracy, who was involved? The CIA organized crime Cuban interests, or some combination of institutional actors pursuing their own objectives. Over the next 3 hours, we'll explore what researchers have discovered about the assassination, examining the physical evidence, the official investigation, the alternative theories, and the declassified documents that have gradually emerged over the past decades. We'll consider the motives of the various actors who might have wanted Kennedy dead. We'll examine the evidence that supports different theories and the evidence that contradicts them. We'll meet the key figures involved, from Lee Harvey Oswald to Jack Ruby, from CIA officials to organized crime figures, from the Warren Commission to subsequent investigators. This is not a definitive answer to the question of what happened on November 22, 1963. Rather, it's an exploration of what we know, what we don't know, and why the truth about this pivotal moment in American history remains contested after more than 60 years. The assassination changed American consciousness. It shattered public confidence in institutions. It raised questions about government credibility that persist to this day. It became a symbol of institutional limits and of the possibility that some truths may remain forever beyond reach. Understanding the Kennedy assassination means understanding not just what happened in Dealey Plaza, but also what that event revealed about American institutions, about the limits of historical investigation, and about the enduring power of uncertainty to shape public consciousness. Tonight's exploration unfolds in several parts. First, we'll examine the assassination itself, the moment, the immediate aftermath, and the initial investigation. Then we'll explore the official narrative, the Warren Commission's investigation, and the controversial conclusions that emerged. We'll consider the various theories that researchers have proposed over the decades, examining the motives and the evidence for each. We'll look at what declassified documents have revealed about government activities and institutional interests. We'll consider the physical evidence and how modern forensic analysis has attempted to clarify the questions that remain. And finally, we'll reflect on what the assassination's enduring mystery tells us about history, about institutions, and about the search for truth. This is a journey designed for thoughtful, unhurried exploration. We'll take our time examining the evidence, considering different perspectives, and acknowledging the genuine uncertainties that remain. We'll move at a pace suited for the evening listening, allowing you to follow the narrative without strain. Whether you're seeking to understand one of history's great mysteries, or simply interested in a thoughtful exploration of a pivotal moment in American history, settle in and let's begin this journey together. November 22, 1963, a day that changed America. On November 22, 1963, the United States experienced a moment that would fracture the national consciousness in ways that persist to this day. President John F. Kennedy, the 35th, President of the United States, traveled to Dallas, Texas on what appeared to be a routine political visit. He was there to raise funds for his 1964 re-election campaign to mend political fences in a state that had voted narrowly for him in 1960 and to shore up support among Texas Democrats. The trip seemed ordinary enough, a president visiting a major American city, shaking hands, giving speeches, connecting with voters. Yet within hours, the trajectory of American history would be fundamentally altered. The motorcade route through Dallas had been planned days in advance. The route was not secret. It was published in the local newspapers so that citizens could line the streets to see their president. This was standard practice in 1963. Security was present but relatively modest by today's standards. The Secret Service had planned the route to maximize public visibility, believing that exposure to crowds was an important part of a president's role in a democratic society. The presidential limousine was a Lincoln Continental convertible chosen specifically because it allowed the president to be seen by crowds. The top was down. Kennedy sat in the back seat, his wife Jackie beside him. Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie sat in front of them. The motorcade moved through downtown Dallas at a slow pace, around 11 miles per hour, allowing crowds to see the president clearly. At 12:30 p.m., the motorcade entered Dealey Plaza, a small park in downtown Dallas, surrounded by office buildings and grassy areas. The plaza was named after George Dealey, a newspaper publisher, and it had become a gathering place for crowds wanting to see the president. Witnesses lined the streets and stood on the grassy areas. Some held signs. Some held cameras. Some simply wanted to be present at this moment in history. The motorcade was approaching the Texas School Book Depository, a 7-story building that housed a company storing and distributing textbooks. The building overlooked the plaza from behind and to the right of the motorcade's path. Then at 12:30 p.m., shots rang out. The exact sequence of events in those next few seconds would become the subject of intense investigation and debate for decades to come. Witnesses heard gunshots. Some reported hearing 3 shots. Some reported hearing 4 or more. Some witnesses reported that the shots came from behind the motorcade from the direction of the Texas School Book Depository. Other witnesses reported that shots came from in front of the motorcade from a grassy area known as the Grassy Knoll. The sound of gunfire in an urban environment travels unpredictably, bouncing off buildings and creating confusion about its source. President Kennedy was struck. The exact sequence of his wounds would become central to the investigation that followed. The motorcade accelerated. Jackie Kennedy cradled her husband as the limousine raced toward Parkland Hospital, just a few miles away. The journey took approximately 4 minutes. At Parkland, medical personnel rushed Kennedy into Trauma Room 1. Doctors worked frantically to save his life, but the wounds were catastrophic. At 1:00 p.m., President John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, who had been riding in a car behind the presidential limousine, was rushed to Air Force One. By 2:38 p.m., Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States aboard the aircraft on the tarmac at Dallas Love Field. The nation learned of Kennedy's death through television and radio. Walter Cronkite, the anchor of the CBS Evening News, announced the president's death with visible emotion. Schools dismissed students early. Businesses closed. Americans gathered around television sets in shock and disbelief. The president, who had seemed so vital and energetic just hours before, was gone. The nation entered a period of collective mourning. Kennedy's body was returned to Washington, D.C. His funeral, held on November the 25th, 1963, was watched by millions of Americans and broadcast internationally. The image of Jackie Kennedy in her pink suit, now stained with blood, walking behind her husband's casket, became one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. But even as the nation mourned, questions began to emerge. Within 90 minutes of the assassination, Dallas police arrested Lee Harvey Oswald at the Texas Theater, a movie house in Dallas. Oswald was a 24-year-old man who worked at the Texas School Book Depository. He had been in the building on the day of the assassination. Police found a rifle in the depository, partially hidden behind boxes of books on the 6th floor. The rifle was a Mannlicher Carcano, an Italian-made bolt-action rifle. It was traced to Oswald, who had purchased it through a mail-order catalog under an assumed name. 3 empty shell casings were found near the window on the 6th floor. The evidence seemed to point clearly to Oswald as the assassin, yet the story was far from over. On November 24, 1963, just 2 days after the assassination, as police were transferring Oswald from the Dallas Police Department to the county jail, a Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby appeared in the basement where Oswald was being moved. Ruby shot Oswald at close range. The shooting was broadcast live on television, making it the first murder witnessed by millions of Americans simultaneously. Oswald died from his wounds within hours. The man accused of assassinating the president would never stand trial. He would never testify about what he knew or didn't know. He would never answer the questions that investigators wanted to ask him. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Witness accounts conflicted. Some people reported seeing a man with a rifle on the 6th floor of the depository. Others reported seeing a man on the grassy knoll in front of the motorcade. Some witnesses reported seeing Oswald in the depository that day. Others reported seeing him elsewhere. The ballistics evidence was unclear. The autopsy findings were subject to different interpretations. The Zapruder film, an 8-minute home video recording the assassination, showed the president's head moving in a direction that some observers found inconsistent with shots coming from behind. Within weeks, President Lyndon B. Johnson established the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination. Chief Justice Earl Warren was appointed to lead the investigation. The commission included prominent political figures and former intelligence officials. Their task was to determine what happened on November 22, 1963, and to provide the American people with answers. The investigation would take 10 months. The commission would interview 552 witnesses and examine thousands of documents. The final report would run to 26 volumes. Yet from that first moment in Dealey Plaza, fundamental questions emerged that would persist for generations. Why was the motorcade route published in advance? How many shooters were there? What happened in those crucial seconds? Why was Oswald killed before he could be tried? What information was withheld from investigators? These questions would drive decades of investigation, research, and debate. The assassination of President Kennedy remains one of the most significant events in American history. It marked the end of an era of relative national confidence and the beginning of a period of institutional skepticism that would shape American consciousness for generations. The uncertainty about what actually happened on November 22, 1963, has proven to be as historically significant as the event itself. Understanding what we know about that day, what we don't know, and how investigators have attempted to determine the truth is essential to understanding modern America. The foundation of all subsequent investigation lies in those first moments in Dealey Plaza, in the accounts of witnesses, in the physical evidence collected, and in the questions that emerged immediately and have never been fully answered. Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused gunman's enigmatic background. Having established the events of November 22, 1963, we now turn to the man accused of the assassination. Understanding Lee Harvey Oswald requires us to examine his life before that fateful day, a biography marked by instability, ideological confusion, and movements that would later seem suspicious to investigators. Who was Lee Harvey Oswald, and what in his background might explain his alleged actions on that November afternoon. Lee Harvey Oswald was born on June 13, 1939 in New Orleans, Louisiana, to a family struggling with poverty and instability. His father, Robert Edward Lee Oswald Sr., was an insurance salesman who died 2 months before Lee's birth. His mother, Marguerite Claverie Oswald, was left to raise 3 sons, Robert Jr., who was 5 years old at the time of Lee's birth, and John Edward, who was 2. Marguerite worked as a nurse to support the family, moving frequently between New Orleans, Texas, and New York as she sought better employment and housing. The family lived in modest circumstances, often in rented apartments or small houses. Young Lee was described by those who knew him as a quiet, withdrawn child. He was not particularly close to his older brothers and seemed to prefer solitude to social interaction. The frequent moves during Oswald's childhood meant that he attended multiple schools and had difficulty establishing stable friendships. In New Orleans, he attended Beauregard Junior High School. In Texas, he attended schools in Fort Worth. In New York, he attended schools in the Bronx. This constant relocation, combined with his introverted nature, made him an outsider in each new environment. Teachers noted that he was intelligent but socially isolated. His mother was often preoccupied with work and financial concerns, leaving young Lee largely to his own devices. By his teenage years, Oswald had developed an interest in leftist political ideology. He read communist literature and expressed sympathy for the Soviet Union. This was unusual for an American teenager in the 1950s during the height of Cold War anti-communist sentiment. In 1956, at the age of 17, Oswald made a significant decision. He joined the United States Marine Corps, enlisting on October 26, 1956. The Marines represented an opportunity for stability, employment, and escape from his difficult family situation. Oswald was assigned to the Marines Radar Operator Training Program. His military records indicate that he was competent at his technical duties, but struggled with military discipline and social integration. Fellow Marines found him unpopular and socially awkward. He was nicknamed Oswald Skovich by his peers, a reference to his interest in Russian language and culture. Some Marines recalled that Oswald spoke Russian and expressed admiration for the Soviet Union. In the context of the 1950s, when anti-communist sentiment was intense, Oswald's political views made him conspicuous and controversial among his fellow servicemen. In 1957, Oswald was stationed at Atsugi Air Base in Japan. This assignment would later become significant to investigators. Atsugi was home to the U-2 spy plane program, a highly classified American intelligence operation. The U-2 was a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft designed to photograph Soviet territory. The program was one of the most sensitive military operations of the Cold War era. Oswald's assignment to Atsugi, combined with his access to radar facilities and his known interest in the Soviet Union, would later fuel speculation about his possible involvement in intelligence operations. However, Oswald's actual duties at Atsugi were limited. He worked as a radar operator, a position that did not provide access to the most sensitive information about the U-2 program. Still, his presence at such a classified facility, combined with his subsequent actions, would raise questions that investigators would struggle to answer definitively. After his discharge from the Marines in September 1959, Oswald made a decision that would profoundly shape his subsequent life and ultimately the investigation into the assassination. On October 16, 1959, Oswald arrived in Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. He had traveled to the Soviet Union ostensibly as a tourist, but with intentions far more significant. On October 31, 1959, Oswald walked into the United States Embassy in Moscow and announced his intention to defect. He renounced his American citizenship and declared his desire to become a Soviet citizen. He offered to provide the Soviet government with information about his military service and his knowledge of American military operations. The embassy staff was astonished. Defections to the Soviet Union were not uncommon during the Cold War, but they were significant events that triggered diplomatic and intelligence responses. The Soviets, however, were suspicious of Oswald. Intelligence agencies in the Soviet Union questioned whether he was a genuine defector or an American spy attempting to infiltrate Soviet society. After several months of uncertainty, the Soviet government granted Oswald permission to remain in the Soviet Union, but did not grant him full Soviet citizenship. Instead, they assigned him to Minsk, a major industrial city in Belarus, approximately 400 miles from Moscow. In Minsk, Oswald was employed at the Minsk Radio Factory, a facility that manufactured electronic equipment. He lived in a small apartment provided by the factory. He earned a modest salary. By Soviet standards of the era, his living conditions were relatively comfortable. He had employment, housing, and access to goods and services that were not available to all Soviet citizens. In Minsk, Oswald's life took another significant turn. He met Marina Nikolaevna Prusakova, a 19-year-old woman who worked as a pharmacist. Marina came from a family with connections to the Soviet military and security apparatus. Her uncle was a colonel in the Soviet secret police, the KGB. Oswald and Marina began a relationship, and on April 30th, 1961, they married. Marina became pregnant, and on February 15th, 1962, their daughter, June Lee Oswald, was born. The birth of his daughter seemed to affect Oswald profoundly. He began to reconsider his decision to remain in the Soviet Union. He missed America. He wanted his daughter to grow up in the United States. In 1961, Oswald applied to the American Embassy for permission to return to the United States. The application process was lengthy and complicated. American officials questioned Oswald about his defection and his intentions. They were concerned that he might be a Soviet agent attempting to return to America as a spy. However, after investigation, American officials determined that Oswald was not a security threat and granted him permission to return. In June 1962, Oswald, Marina, and their infant daughter returned to the United States. They settled in Fort Worth, Texas, where Oswald's mother lived. Oswald sought employment working as a sheet metal worker and later as a laborer at various companies. His employment record was inconsistent. He would work for a company for a period of time and then leave or be dismissed. He struggled to maintain stable employment. He also struggled to adjust to American life after his years in the Soviet Union. His marriage to Marina was turbulent. Oswald was often jealous and controlling. Marina, for her part, was adjusting to American life, learning English, and raising their daughter while dealing with her husband's emotional instability. In the spring of 1963, Oswald moved to New Orleans, where he sought employment and became involved in political activism. He took a job at the William Riley Coffee Company as a maintenance worker. More significantly, he became involved with pro-Castro organizations. He joined the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, an organization that supported Fidel Castro's revolutionary government in Cuba. Oswald became the New Orleans coordinator for the organization, though his involvement was largely solitary. He distributed leaflets supporting Cuba and advocating for the normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba. This activism was notable because it occurred during a period of intense American hostility toward Cuba. The Bay of Pigs invasion had occurred in 1961. The Cuban Missile Crisis had occurred in October 1962. American policy toward Cuba was one of strict embargo and isolation. Oswald's public support for Cuba was therefore politically controversial and conspicuous. In August 1963, Oswald attempted to travel to Cuba. He visited the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, seeking a visa that would allow him to travel to Cuba. His stated intention was to travel to Cuba and then to the Soviet Union. However, the Cuban government denied him a visa. The reasons for the denial remain unclear. Some researchers have speculated that Cuban officials were suspicious of Oswald fearing that he might be an American agent attempting to infiltrate Cuba. Others have suggested that the Cubans simply did not believe that Oswald was a genuine revolutionary sympathizer. Whatever the reason, Oswald's attempt to reach Cuba was unsuccessful. He returned to the United States frustrated and disappointed. In October 1963, Oswald moved to Dallas, Texas. He obtained employment at the Texas School Book Depository on October 16, 1963, just weeks before the assassination. The depository was a warehouse that stored and distributed textbooks to schools throughout Texas. Oswald worked as a laborer, filling orders and preparing shipments. His employment record at the depository was unremarkable. He performed his duties adequately, but was not particularly engaged or motivated. His co-workers remembered him as quiet and withdrawn, much as his peers in the Marines and in other employment situations had described him. The trajectory of Oswald's life before November 22, 1963 presents a complex and contradictory picture. He was a man who seemed perpetually adrift, moving from place to place, job to job, ideology to ideology. He was intelligent but socially maladjusted. He expressed radical political views but seemed to lack genuine ideological commitment. He defected to the Soviet Union but then returned to America. He supported Cuba but was denied entry to the country. He was involved in various organizations and activities, but seemed to be a peripheral figure in each. His movements, his associations, and the contradictions in his behavior would later fuel intense speculation about his true allegiances and motivations. Was he a genuine communist sympathizer? Was he a Soviet or Cuban agent? Was he simply a confused and troubled young man seeking significance in a world that seemed to reject him? These questions would drive the investigation into the assassination and would remain contested for decades to come. Oswald's biography reads like a Cold War spy novel filled with suspicious turns and unexplained decisions. His defection to the Soviet Union, his work at a facility involved in classified military operations, his marriage to a woman with connections to the Soviet security apparatus, his subsequent return to America, his involvement with pro-Castro organizations, his attempt to reach Cuba, and his employment at a building overlooking the presidential motorcade route. All of these elements seem too coincidental to be mere chance. Yet investigators would struggle to determine whether these elements indicated genuine conspiracy, or were simply the consequences of a troubled man's erratic life choices. As we examine the investigation that followed the assassination, we will see how Oswald's enigmatic background became central to the debate about what actually happened on November 22, 1963. The Warren Commission, America's official investigation. Having examined Lee Harvey Oswald's enigmatic background, we now turn to how the American government investigated the assassination. Within days of President Kennedy's death, the nation faced a critical question. What mechanisms would be used to determine the truth about what happened in Dealey Plaza? The answer came in the form of an official commission that would shape the narrative of the assassination for decades to come. On November 29, 1963, just 7 days after the assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson issued Executive Order 1130 establishing the President's Commission on the assassination of President Kennedy. Johnson appointed Chief Justice Earl Warren, the highest-ranking judicial official in the United States, to lead the investigation. Warren was a respected figure, known for his judicial independence and his role in landmark Supreme Court decisions. He was also 72 years old and had indicated his intention to retire from the bench. Some observers questioned whether appointing a sitting Chief Justice to lead a special commission was appropriate, but Johnson believed that Warren's stature and credibility were essential to public confidence in the investigation. The commission itself was composed of prominent political and institutional figures. Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, a powerful Democratic politician and chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, was appointed. Senator Sherman Cooper of Kentucky, a respected Republican, was also included. Representative Hale Boggs of Louisiana, a senior Democratic congressman, joined the commission. Representative Gerald Ford of Michigan, a rising Republican politician, was appointed as well. Former CIA Director Allen Dulles was included, despite the fact that he had been dismissed by President Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs invasion. Former World Bank President John J. McCloy, a prominent businessman and government official, rounded out the 7-member commission. The composition of the commission would later become a subject of criticism. The inclusion of Allen Dulles, a CIA official, with institutional reasons to avoid implicating the agency in the assassination, raised questions about potential conflicts of interest. The inclusion of powerful politicians raised questions about whether political considerations might influence the investigation. However, at the time of the commission's formation, these concerns were not widely voiced. The nation was in shock and grief. There was a widespread desire for answers and for reassurance that the government understood what had happened and could prevent such tragedies in the future. The Warren Commission began its work in December 1963 and operated for 10 months, concluding its investigation in September 1964. The commission's staff included lawyers, investigators, and support personnel. The commission interviewed 552 witnesses and examined thousands of documents. They reviewed the autopsy findings, the ballistics evidence, the photographs and films of the assassination, and the statements of those present in Dealey Plaza. The commission's investigation was extensive in scope, though questions would later arise about whether it was thorough in its examination of certain areas. The commission's central task was to determine who assassinated President Kennedy and whether the assassination was the work of a single individual or part of a larger conspiracy. The commission examined the evidence against Lee Harvey Oswald, including his employment at the Texas School Book Depository, the rifle found in the building, the shell casings recovered from the 6th floor, and witness testimony placing Oswald in the building on the day of the assassination. The commission also examined Oswald's background, his political views, his connections to pro-Castro organizations, and his defection to the Soviet Union. The commission concluded that the evidence pointed to Oswald as the assassin. However, the commission faced a significant evidentiary problem. If Oswald had fired all the shots from the Texas School Book Depository, how could both President Kennedy and Governor Connally have been wounded? The two men were seated at different heights and at different angles in the presidential limousine. If separate bullets had struck each man, it would suggest multiple shooters, and therefore a conspiracy. To resolve this problem, the commission proposed what became known as the single bullet theory. According to this theory, a single bullet fired from Oswald's rifle entered President Kennedy's back, exited through his neck, and then struck Governor Connally in the chest, wrist, and thigh. This single bullet would account for all the wounds to both men, allowing the commission to conclude that Oswald acted alone. The single bullet theory became the linchpin of the commission's conclusion. If the theory was correct, then a lone gunman could have inflicted all the wounds. If the theory was incorrect, then multiple shooters must have been involved, suggesting a conspiracy. The commission's ballistics experts examined the trajectory of the bullets, the positions of Kennedy and Connally in the limousine, and the Zapruder film, which showed the assassination from start to finish. Based on this analysis, the commission's experts concluded that the single bullet theory was consistent with the available evidence. However, the commission's methodology came under scrutiny, even at the time, and increasingly so in subsequent decades. The commission did not conduct independent ballistic tests to verify whether the Mannlicher Carcano rifle could have fired the shots with the accuracy and speed required by the commission's theory. Instead, the Commission relied heavily on ballistics analysis conducted by the FBI and the Secret Service. The Commission did not thoroughly investigate potential conspiracies. While the Commission examined Oswald's connections to pro-Castro organizations and his defection to the Soviet Union, it did not conduct a comprehensive investigation into possible involvement by organized crime, the CIA, or Cuban interests. The Commission did not subpoena certain witnesses or documents that might have shed light on these areas. The Commission's final report, published in September 1964, ran to 26 volumes. The main report presented the Commission's findings and conclusions. The supporting volumes contained witness testimony, documents, photographs, and analysis. The Commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President Kennedy by firing 3 shots from the Texas School Book Depository. The Commission concluded that Oswald acted alone and that there was no evidence of a conspiracy. The Commission concluded that Jack Ruby's killing of Oswald was a spontaneous act driven by Ruby's emotional response to Kennedy's death, not part of a larger conspiracy. The Warren Commission's report was initially accepted by the American public and by most of the media. The report provided a clear narrative and a definitive conclusion. It offered reassurance that the assassination was not part of a larger conspiracy that might threaten national security. However, as time passed and as new information emerged, skepticism about the Commission's conclusions grew. In the late 1960s and 1970s, critics began to question the Commission's methodology and conclusions. They pointed out that the Commission had not conducted independent investigations in certain areas. They noted that the Commission had relied heavily on government agencies that had institutional reasons to avoid implicating themselves in the assassination. They questioned whether the single bullet theory was physically plausible. They noted that the Commission had not thoroughly investigated potential conspiracies. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, which reopened the investigation in 1976, found significant problems with the Warren Commission's work. The House Committee concluded that the Commission had not adequately investigated the possibility of a conspiracy. The House Committee's acoustic analysis suggested that there may have been 4 shots fired, with one possibly coming from a different location than the Texas School Book Depository. The House Committee concluded that a conspiracy was likely based on the acoustic evidence, directly contradicting the Warren Commission's conclusion that Oswald acted alone. Declassified documents released in subsequent decades revealed that the FBI and CIA had withheld information from the Warren Commission. The FBI had been monitoring Oswald since his return from the Soviet Union in 1962, but this surveillance was not fully disclosed to the Commission. The CIA had conducted surveillance of Oswald in Mexico City in October 1963, but details of this surveillance were not shared with the Commission. The CIA had been involved in multiple assassination plots against Fidel Castro, some in partnership with organized crime figures, but this information was not available to the Commission. These revelations suggested that the Warren Commission had operated with incomplete information, whether by design or institutional compartmentalization. The Warren Commission's work shaped the official narrative of the assassination for decades. The Commission's conclusion that Oswald acted alone became the baseline from which all subsequent investigations and theories departed. However, the Commission's methodology and conclusions would become the subject of intense scrutiny and alternative investigations. Researchers devoted careers to examining the Commission's evidence and conclusions. Some researchers concluded that the Commission's findings were fundamentally sound despite methodological limitations. Others concluded that the Commission had failed to investigate crucial areas and had reached conclusions that were not fully supported by the evidence. The debate about the Warren Commission's work remains active today, more than 60 years after the assassination. The Commission's investigation revealed the challenges inherent in determining historical truth. The Commission had access to extensive evidence, but the interpretation of that evidence was subject to different analytical frameworks and assumptions. The Commission's conclusions were shaped not only by the evidence, but also by institutional interests and political considerations. The Commission seemed designed to reach a predetermined conclusion that Oswald acted alone rather than to follow evidence wherever it led. Whether this was the result of deliberate design or unconscious bias remains a matter of debate. What is clear is that the Warren Commission's work, despite its limitations and controversies, remains central to any understanding of the Kennedy assassination. As we examine the physical evidence in greater detail, we will see how the same evidence has been interpreted differently by different investigators, and how the questions raised by the Commission's work have only deepened with time. The single bullet theory, physics evidence, and doubt. The Warren Commission's conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone rested on a single piece of evidence that would become the most debated aspect of the entire investigation. This evidence was not a weapon, not a fingerprint, not a confession. It was a theory about the trajectory of a bullet. To understand how one man could have wounded both President Kennedy and Governor Connally with the shots fired from the Texas School Book Depository, the Commission proposed what became known as the single bullet theory. This theory would define the assassination debate for generations and would ultimately become the foundation upon which all subsequent investigations and alternative theories would build. The problem the Commission faced was straightforward but significant. President Kennedy and Governor John Connally were seated at different positions in the presidential limousine. Kennedy sat in the back seat on the right side. Connally sat in front of Kennedy, also on the right side, but lower and inward. If separate bullets had struck each man, the evidence would suggest that there were multiple shooters firing from different positions. Multiple shooters would indicate a conspiracy. The Commission needed to explain how a single shooter firing from the Texas School Book Depository could have inflicted all the wounds to both men. The answer was the single bullet theory. According to the theory, a single bullet fired from Lee Harvey Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano rifle entered President Kennedy's back below his right shoulder blade. The bullet traveled downward and forward through Kennedy's body, exiting through his neck. After exiting Kennedy's neck, the bullet continued its trajectory and struck Governor Connally in the chest, just below his right shoulder. The bullet then passed through Connally's chest and exited on his right side. The bullet then struck Connally's wrist, shattering bone. Finally, the bullet struck Connally's left thigh, lodging in the thigh tissue. This single bullet, according to the Commission's theory, accounted for 7 separate wounds across 2 men. The theory seemed implausible to many observers. How could a single bullet change direction so dramatically? How could it remain largely intact after passing through so much tissue and bone? How could it strike so many different locations? To support the single bullet theory, the Commission relied heavily on analysis of the Zapruder film, an 8mm home video recording of the assassination. Abraham Zapruder, a Dallas businessman, had filmed the motorcade as it passed through Dealey Plaza. His camera captured approximately 26 seconds of footage, including the moments of the assassination. The film showed the exact positions of Kennedy and Connally at various moments. It showed the timing of the shots. It showed the reactions of the occupants of the limousine. The Commission's ballistics experts used the Zapruder film to calculate the trajectory of the bullets and to determine whether the single bullet theory was consistent with the visual evidence. The Commission's analysis suggested that the single bullet theory was plausible. The experts calculated that if a bullet entered Kennedy's back at a certain angle and exited his neck at a certain angle, it could have continued on a trajectory that would strike Connally in the chest. The experts noted that Connally was seated inward and lower than Kennedy, which would allow a bullet exiting Kennedy's neck to strike Connally. The experts concluded that the single bullet theory was consistent with the available evidence However, the analysis involved numerous assumptions about the exact positions of Kennedy and Connolly, the exact angle of the shots, and the exact behavior of the bullet as it passed through tissue and bone. Independent ballistics experts have questioned the single bullet theory since the Commission first proposed it. The Mannlicher Carcano rifle, the weapon allegedly used by Oswald, is notoriously unreliable and difficult to aim accurately. The rifle has a slow rate of fire. Firing 3 shots with the accuracy required by the Commission's theory in the time frame suggested by the evidence seemed difficult, even for an experienced marksman. Some experts have argued that the bullet's trajectory, as described by the Commission, is inconsistent with the known physics of bullet behavior. A bullet passing through tissue and bone typically loses velocity and may change direction, but the changes described by the Commission seemed extreme to some experts. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, which reopened the investigation in 1976, commissioned extensive ballistics analysis. The committee's experts examined the single bullet theory and concluded that while it was possible, it was improbable. The committee noted that the bullet would have had to pass through substantial amounts of tissue and bone while remaining largely intact. The committee noted that the bullet would have had to change direction in ways that seemed inconsistent with normal bullet behavior. However, the committee did not definitively reject the theory. Instead, the committee concluded that the single bullet theory was possible, but unlikely. The Zapruder film itself became a subject of intense scrutiny and debate. The film appeared to show Kennedy's head moving backward after the fatal shot. If the shot came from behind, as the Commission concluded, Kennedy's head should have moved forward away from the direction of the shot. The backward motion of Kennedy's head seemed to some observers to suggest that the fatal shot came from the front, not from behind. This would indicate a second shooter. The Commission's experts argued that the backward head movement could be explained by neuromuscular reaction. When the brain is severely damaged, muscles can contract involuntarily, causing the body to move in unexpected directions. The Commission's experts argued that this neuromuscular reaction could explain Kennedy's backward head movement, despite the shot coming from behind. However, independent experts have questioned this explanation. Some have argued that neuromuscular reaction would not be strong enough to cause such a dramatic backward movement of the head. Some have argued that the backward movement is more consistent with a shot from the front. The debate about the Zapruder film and what it shows has continued for decades. The film has been enhanced, analyzed and reanalyzed using increasingly sophisticated technology. Yet experts continue to disagree about what the film shows and what conclusions can be drawn from it. The single bullet theory has become the central point of contention in the assassination debate. Those who accept the theory generally accept the Commission's conclusion that Oswald acted alone. Those who reject the theory generally believe that a conspiracy was involved. The theory has been tested, challenged, and defended countless times. Computer models have been created to simulate the bullet's trajectory. Ballistics experts have conducted experiments. Physicists have analyzed the evidence. Yet after more than 60 years, the single bullet theory remains contested. Some experts believe it is plausible and consistent with the evidence. Other experts believe it is implausible and inconsistent with the evidence. The disagreement among experts reflects the genuine ambiguities in the evidence and the difficulty of determining historical truth from physical evidence alone. The single bullet theory illustrates a fundamental challenge in the assassination investigation. Physical evidence, while concrete and seemingly objective, requires interpretation. The interpretation of evidence depends on assumptions about how the evidence was created and how it should be analyzed. Different experts examining the same evidence can reach different conclusions based on different assumptions. The single bullet theory is not inherently implausible. A single bullet could theoretically pass through 2 people and cause multiple wounds. However, whether this particular bullet did so remains a matter of debate. The theory's plausibility depends on accepting a particular set of assumptions about the positions of Kennedy and Connolly, the angle of the shot, the behavior of the bullet, and the interpretation of the Zapruder film. Some experts accept these assumptions, others do not. The single bullet theory also illustrates the importance of independent verification in historical investigation. The Warren Commission relied on ballistics analysis conducted by the FBI and Secret Service. These agencies had institutional reasons to support the conclusion that Oswald acted alone. Independent ballistics experts examining the same evidence years later reached different conclusions about the plausibility of the theory. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, which commissioned independent analysis, concluded that the theory was possible but improbable. This independent analysis suggested that the Commission's conclusion might have been influenced by institutional interests rather than by objective analysis of the evidence. The debate about the single bullet theory continues to this day. Researchers continue to examine the evidence, propose new analyses, and challenge existing conclusions. The theory remains the foundation of the official narrative of the assassination, yet it remains the most contested element of that narrative. As we examine other aspects of the assassination evidence, we will see how the single bullet theory connects to broader questions about the assassination, and how different interpretations of evidence lead to different conclusions about what actually happened on November 28, 1963. The theory's enduring controversy reflects the genuine difficulty of determining historical truth from physical evidence, and the importance of considering multiple perspectives when evaluating complex historical events. The CIA connection, covert operations, and hidden agendas. We have examined the physical evidence and the official investigation. Yet questions remain about the institutional forces that may have shaped both the assassination and the investigation that followed. The Central Intelligence Agency occupies a unique position in the assassination narrative. The agency had documented interest in both Lee Harvey Oswald and Cuba. The agency had institutional reasons to view President Kennedy with suspicion, and the agency had the capability to conduct operations that might never be publicly revealed. Understanding the CIA's role requires us to examine the agency's operations against Cuba, its relationship with Oswald, and the tensions between the president and the intelligence community in the years before the assassination. The CIA's involvement with Cuba began long before the Kennedy administration took office. After Fidel Castro's revolutionary government came to power in 1959, the United States government viewed Cuba as a threat to American interests in the Western Hemisphere. The Eisenhower administration authorized the CIA to begin planning operations to remove Castro from power. These operations included support for Cuban exiles who opposed Castro's government. They included sabotage operations designed to damage Cuba's economy and infrastructure. Most significantly, they included assassination plots against Castro himself. When President Kennedy took office in January 1961, he inherited these CIA operations and the agency's commitment to removing Castro. In April 1961, the CIA launched the Bay of Pigs invasion, an operation designed to overthrow Castro's government. The invasion involved approximately 400 Cuban exiles, trained and equipped by the CIA, who landed on the coast of Cuba with the intention of establishing a beachhead and sparking a popular uprising against Castro. The operation was a catastrophic failure. The expected popular uprising did not materialize. Castro's forces quickly surrounded and defeated the invading exiles. Approximately 114 exiles were killed, and more than 100 were captured. The invasion was a humiliation for the Kennedy administration and a significant setback for American foreign policy. President Kennedy refused to provide air support for the invasion, a decision that deeply angered CIA leadership. The CIA believed that air support was essential to the operation's success. Without air support, the invasion was doomed from the beginning. CIA Director Allen Dulles and his deputy Richard Bissell believed that Kennedy had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The relationship between Kennedy and the CIA was damaged by the Bay of Pigs failure. Kennedy eventually dismissed Dulles and Bissell from their positions, replacing Dulles with John McCone as CIA Director. However, the damage to the relationship between the president and the intelligence community was profound and lasting. After the Bay of Pigs failure, the CIA intensified its efforts to remove Castro through a program called Operation Mongoose. This operation, authorized by the Kennedy administration in November 1961, included a range of activities designed to destabilize Castro's government and ultimately to remove him from power. Operation Mongoose included assassination plots against Castro. The CIA partnered with organized crime figures, including Sam Giancana and John Roselli, to plan and execute assassination attempts against the Cuban leader. The operation included sabotage of Cuban industrial facilities, support for exile groups conducting raids against Cuba, and psychological operations designed to undermine public confidence in Castro's government. Operation Mongoose was one of the most extensive covert operations ever conducted by the United States government. Declassified documents reveal that the CIA had been monitoring Lee Harvey Oswald since his defection to the Soviet Union in 1959. The agency maintained a file on Oswald throughout his time in the Soviet Union. When Oswald returned to the United States in 1962, the CIA interviewed him. The agency wanted to determine whether Oswald had been recruited by Soviet intelligence and whether he posed a security threat to the United States. The CIA concluded that Oswald was not a security threat and did not appear to have been recruited by Soviet intelligence. However, the CIA's interest in Oswald and its knowledge of his movements and associations raised questions about the extent of the agency's knowledge of Oswald's activities in the months before the assassination. Some researchers have argued that Oswald may have been involved in CIA activities, either as a witting or an unwitting participant. Oswald's employment at a facility involved in classified military operations, his defection to the Soviet Union, his return to America, and his involvement with pro-Castro organizations could all be consistent with CIA involvement. However, the CIA has consistently denied any involvement with Oswald. No declassified documents have provided definitive evidence of CIA involvement with Oswald. The question remains speculative, based on circumstantial evidence and the pattern of Oswald's movements, rather than on direct evidence of CIA contact or cooperation. More provocatively, some historians have suggested that Kennedy's reluctance to support further military action against Cuba, combined with his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, made him a liability to hardline CIA officials. In October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba approximately 90 miles from the coast of Florida. President Kennedy responded by imposing a naval blockade on Cuba and demanding that the Soviets remove the missiles. After 13 days of intense diplomatic and military tension, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles. Kennedy also agreed in a secret understanding to remove American missiles from Turkey. From the perspective of hardline CIA officials and anti-Castro activists, Kennedy's handling of the crisis represented a capitulation to Soviet pressure. The missiles were removed, but Castro remained in power. The opportunity to remove Castro during the crisis had been missed. In the months following the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy began to move toward a policy of détente with the Soviet Union and a more cautious approach to Cuba. Kennedy authorized the continuation of Operation Mongoose, but with less aggressive tactics. Kennedy was concerned about the risks of escalation and the possibility of nuclear war. He was also concerned about the political costs of military adventures abroad. From the perspective of hardline CIA officials and anti-Castro activists. Kennedy's caution represented a betrayal of the commitment to remove Castro. Some researchers have suggested that this divergence between Kennedy's policy and the CIA's objectives created a motive for removing Kennedy. If Kennedy were removed and replaced with a more aggressive vice president or successor, the argument goes that CIA's objectives regarding Cuba might be achieved. Allen Dulles, the CIA director whom Kennedy had dismissed after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, sat on the Warren Commission itself. This position created an inherent conflict of interest. Dulles had institutional reasons to avoid implicating the CIA in the assassination. If the CIA had been involved in the assassination either directly or indirectly, Dulles would have strong incentives to conceal this involvement. Dulles's presence on the commission meant that the commission's investigation of the CIA's possible involvement in the assassination was conducted by a man who had every reason to protect the agency. Critics have argued that Dulles used his position on the commission to steer the investigation away from areas that might implicate the CIA. The CIA's compartmentalized structure meant that different divisions of the agency might have been pursuing contradictory objectives without full oversight or coordination. The division responsible for Operation Mongoose might have had different objectives than the division responsible for monitoring Oswald. The division involved in assassination plots against Castro might have had different objectives than the division responsible for liaison with the Warren Commission. In such a compartmentalized structure, it is theoretically possible that elements within the agency could have been involved in activities that other elements of the agency were unaware of or did not approve of. This compartmentalization makes it difficult to determine the full extent of the CIA's knowledge and involvement in events related to the assassination. Declassified documents have revealed that the CIA withheld information from the Warren Commission. The agency did not fully disclose its surveillance of Oswald. The agency did not disclose the full extent of Operation Mongoose or the assassination plots against Castro. The agency did not disclose its connections to organized crime figures involved in anti-Castro activities. These omissions meant that the Warren Commission operated with incomplete information about the CIA's activities and the agency's possible motives regarding the assassination. Whether these omissions were deliberate or resulted from institutional compartmentalization remains unclear. What is clear is that the CIA's institutional interests and the agency's activities in the years before the assassination created a situation in which the agency had both motive and opportunity to influence the investigation. The CIA's documented interest in both Oswald and Cuba, combined with the agency's institutional animosity toward Kennedy, creates a circumstantial case for motive. The agency had been deeply humiliated by the Bay of Pigs failure. The agency's objectives regarding Cuba had been thwarted by Kennedy's caution and reluctance to support military action. The agency had been involved in extensive covert operations, including assassination plots that Kennedy had authorized but then constrained. The agency had dismissed its leadership at Kennedy's behest. From this perspective, removing Kennedy and replacing him with a more aggressive successor might have seemed advantageous to hardline CIA officials. However, direct evidence linking the agency to the assassination remains elusive. No declassified documents have provided definitive proof of CIA involvement in the assassination. The circumstantial case for motive does not constitute proof of involvement in the crime. The question of the CIA's possible involvement in the assassination remains one of the most debated aspects of the assassination narrative. The agency's documented activities, its institutional interests, and its withholding of information from investigators all suggest that the agency may have had knowledge of or involvement in events related to the assassination. Yet the absence of direct evidence means that any conclusion about CIA involvement remains speculative. As we examine other potential conspirators and their possible motives, We will see how the question of institutional involvement complicates the assassination narrative and how the absence of definitive evidence has allowed multiple theories to persist for decades. The Mafia angle, organized crime and presidential vendetta. Having examined the CIA's institutional interests and possible motives, we now turn to another powerful force in American society during the early 1960s: organized crime. The relationship between the Kennedy family and the mob was complex, contradictory, and ultimately tragic. The Kennedys had benefited from mob connections in their rise to power, yet once in office, they launched an unprecedented assault on organized crime. This contradiction would create enemies with both motive and capability to harm the president. Understanding the mob's possible involvement in the assassination requires us to examine this troubled relationship and the grievances that organized crime figures harbored against the Kennedy administration. The Kennedy family's connection to organized crime predated John F. Kennedy's presidency. In the 1960 presidential campaign, some historians argue that mob connections helped secure votes in crucial states, particularly Illinois. The election of 1960 was extraordinarily close. Kennedy defeated Republican Richard Nixon by fewer than 120,000 votes nationally. In Illinois, Kennedy won by approximately 8,000 votes. Some observers have suggested that organized crime figures in Chicago, working through their political connections, helped deliver Illinois to Kennedy. Whether this assistance was decisive remains debated, but the possibility that Kennedy owed a political debt to the mob was understood by both the Kennedys and the organized crime figures themselves. However, once in office, President Kennedy and his brother, Robert F. Kennedy, who became Attorney General, made a dramatic decision. Rather than honoring any implicit debt to organized crime, they launched an aggressive campaign against the mob. This campaign was unprecedented in its scope and intensity. Robert Kennedy became the driving force behind the assault on organized crime. He established a special task force within the Justice Department dedicated to prosecuting mob figures. He personally pursued high-profile cases against some of the most powerful organized crime leaders in America. The targets of Robert Kennedy's prosecutions included Sam Giancana, the boss of the Chicago mob, Carlos Marcello, the boss of the New Orleans mob, and Jimmy Hoffa, the powerful leader of the Teamsters Union, which had extensive connections to organized crime. Sam Giancana was one of the most powerful mob figures in America in the early 1960s. He controlled organized crime operations in Chicago and had influence in Las Vegas and other cities. Giancana had allegedly assisted in Kennedy's 1960 campaign victory. Now, as Attorney General, Robert Kennedy pursued Giancana relentlessly. The Justice Department increased surveillance of Giancana. Federal agents followed him, monitored his communications, and investigated his business operations. Giancana was eventually convicted of tax evasion and served time in prison. The humiliation of being pursued by the Justice Department, particularly by a man who Giancana believed owed him a debt, created deep resentment. Carlos Marcello controlled organized crime in New Orleans and had extensive operations throughout Louisiana and the Gulf Coast. Marcello was a naturalized American citizen, but he had been born in Tunisia. Robert Kennedy pursued a strategy to deport Marcello, arguing that his citizenship had been obtained fraudulently. In 1961, Marcello was arrested and deported to Guatemala. He eventually made his way back to the United States, but the experience left him bitter and vengeful. According to some accounts, Marcello made explicit threats against President Kennedy. In one account, Marcello allegedly said that Kennedy should be killed, that it would be easy to do, and that it would be done by someone who could not be traced back to Marcello. Whether this account is accurate remains disputed, but it reflects the depth of Marcello's animosity toward the Kennedy administration. Jimmy Hoffa was the powerful leader of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, one of the largest unions in America. Hoffa had extensive connections to organized crime and was involved in various criminal enterprises. Robert Kennedy pursued Hoffa with particular intensity. Kennedy believed that Hoffa was corrupt and that he was exploiting the Teamsters Union for personal gain. Kennedy pursued multiple prosecutions against Hoffa, eventually securing a conviction for jury tampering. Hoffa was sentenced to prison. Like Giancana and Marcello, Hoffa harbored deep resentment toward Robert Kennedy, and by extension, toward President Kennedy. The Kennedys' war on the mob was personal and relentless. Robert Kennedy was not simply pursuing abstract policy objectives. He seemed to take the prosecutions personally, viewing organized crime figures as enemies who needed to be defeated. This personal intensity made the conflict with the mob more bitter and more dangerous. Organized crime figures were accustomed to dealing with political pressure through negotiation, bribery, and political influence. They were not accustomed to being pursued so aggressively by a government official who seemed immune to their usual methods of influence. The Kennedys' assault on the mob created a situation in which organized crime figures felt threatened in ways they had not experienced before. Simultaneously, the Kennedy administration was attempting to remove Fidel Castro from power in Cuba. Some mob figures, particularly those with business interests in pre-revolutionary Cuba, had their own reasons for wanting Castro eliminated. Before the revolution, organized crime had extensive operations in Cuba, including casinos, hotels, and other businesses. These operations were highly profitable. After Castro came to power and seized American property, the mob lost these operations and the income they generated. Organized crime figures wanted Castro removed so that they could reclaim their Cuban operations. The CIA, seeking allies in its anti-Castro efforts, allegedly partnered with organized crime figures to plan assassination attempts against the Cuban leader. This created a strange and troubling alliance. The Kennedys were prosecuting the same mobsters they were indirectly working with against Castro. This contradiction was not lost on organized crime figures. They were being prosecuted by the Justice Department while simultaneously being asked to participate in covert operations against Cuba. When these assassination plots failed, some researchers argue that mob figures felt betrayed and abandoned by the administration. They had risked their safety and their operations by participating in anti-Castro activities, and they had received nothing in return except continued prosecution. The sense of betrayal added to the resentment that organized crime figures already harbored toward the Kennedy administration. The question of organized crime's possible involvement in the assassination has been the subject of extensive investigation and debate. Some researchers have theorized that the mob feeling, threatened by Robert Kennedy's prosecutions and angered by the failed Castro plots, orchestrated Kennedy's assassination. The theory suggests that organized crime figures decided that removing President Kennedy would eliminate the threat posed by Robert Kennedy's Justice Department. With Kennedy gone, the theory goes a new administration might be less aggressive in pursuing organized crime. The theory also suggests that organized crime figures might have hoped that Kennedy's assassination would be blamed on Castro or on communist elements, thereby justifying further military action against Cuba and providing an opportunity to reclaim mob operations in Cuba. Jack Ruby, the man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, had connections to organized crime in Dallas. Ruby was a nightclub owner with ties to various criminal enterprises. Some researchers have suggested that Ruby's killing of Oswald was not a spontaneous act driven by emotional response to Kennedy's death, but rather a deliberate action taken to silence Oswald before he could reveal information about a larger conspiracy. If Oswald had testified at trial, the theory goes he might have revealed connections to organized crime or other conspirators. By killing Oswald, Ruby ensured that Oswald would never testify. This theory suggests that Ruby was acting on behalf of organized crime figures who wanted Oswald silenced. However, connecting organized crime's documented motive to the actual assassination requires accepting a level of coordination and operational security that organized crime had not previously demonstrated. Organized crime operations were typically compartmentalized and localized. While organized crime figures had demonstrated capacity for violence and had committed murders, orchestrating the assassination of a president would have required a level of coordination across multiple cities and organizations that seemed inconsistent with how organized crime typically operated. The assassination would have required precise planning coordination with other potential conspirators and an ability to keep the conspiracy secret. Organized crime had not previously demonstrated such capability. Moreover, the theory requires assuming that organized crime figures could have recruited or controlled Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald was not connected to organized crime in any documented way. He had no criminal record. He had no known associations with mob figures. The theory requires assuming that organized crime could have placed Oswald in the Texas school book depository and positioned him to assassinate the president. This level of control over an individual with no prior connection to organized crime seemed implausible to many investigators. The mob's documented conflicts with the Kennedy administration and their demonstrated capacity for violence create a plausible motive for wanting Kennedy dead. The documented grievances of figures like Giancana Marcello and Hoffa were real and significant. The sense of betrayal regarding the failed Castro plots was genuine. The threat posed by Robert Kennedy's prosecutions was existential to organized crime's operations. Yet the absence of direct evidence linking organized crime to the assassination means that any conclusion about mob involvement remains speculative. No declassified documents have provided definitive proof of organized crime involvement in the assassination. The circumstantial case for motive does not constitute proof of involvement in the crime. As we continue to examine other potential conspirators and their possible motives, we will see how multiple groups had reasons to want Kennedy removed, yet definitive proof of conspiracy remains elusive. Cuba and Castro, revolutionary motives and Cold War tensions. We have examined potential conspirators within American institutions and organized crime, yet we must also consider international actors who had compelling reasons to want President Kennedy removed from power. Fidel Castro and the Cuban government represent another possible source of conspiracy. Castro had endured years of American military and covert operations designed to overthrow his government. He had survived assassination attempts. He had watched as the United States attempted to isolate Cuba economically and diplomatically. Could Castro have decided that removing Kennedy was necessary for Cuba's survival? Could elements within Cuban intelligence have orchestrated the assassination? These questions have intrigued investigators and researchers for decades. Fidel Castro had every reason to fear President Kennedy. The Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, though ultimately a failure, demonstrated American commitment to removing him from power. The invasion involved approximately 400 Cuban exiles, trained and equipped by the CIA, who attempted to establish a beachhead on Cuban soil and spark a popular uprising against Castro's government. The invasion failed, but it revealed the depths of American hostility toward Castro's regime. Castro understood that the United States would not accept his government indefinitely. He understood that American military and intelligence resources would continue to be directed toward his overthrow. The Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war and intensified Castro's sense of vulnerability. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba approximately 90 miles from the coast of Florida. President Kennedy responded by imposing a naval blockade on Cuba and demanding that the Soviets remove the missiles. For 13 days, the world lived under the threat of nuclear war. American military forces were placed on high alert. The possibility of American military invasion of Cuba seemed imminent. Ultimately, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles, and Kennedy agreed in a secret understanding to remove American missiles from Turkey. From Castro's perspective, the Cuban Missile Crisis represented a betrayal by the Soviet Union. Khrushchev had backed down in the face of American pressure. The missiles were removed. Castro remained in power, but only because Khrushchev had capitulated to American demands. Castro felt abandoned by his Soviet ally. He remained deeply suspicious of American intentions. He understood that the United States remained committed to his overthrow and that the Soviet Union might not be a reliable protector of Cuban independence. The experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis left Castro acutely aware of Cuba's vulnerability and of the continued threat posed by the United States. Operation Mongoose, the CIA's covert campaign against Cuba, intensified Castro's sense of threat. The operation, authorized by the Kennedy administration in November 1961, included a range of activities designed to destabilize Castro's government and ultimately to remove him from power. Operation Mongoose included sabotage of Cuban industrial facilities, including sugar refineries and petroleum storage facilities. The operation included support for exile groups, conducting raids against Cuba from bases in Florida. The operation included psychological operations designed to undermine public confidence in Castro's government. Most significantly, Operation Mongoose included multiple assassination attempts against Castro himself. The CIA partnered with organized crime figures and with Cuban exiles to plan and execute these assassination attempts. By 1963, Castro was acutely aware that the United States remained committed to his overthrow and that American intelligence agencies were actively working to kill him. By 1963, Castro faced a situation in which the United States remained hostile. The Soviet Union had proven unreliable, and American covert operations continued to threaten his government and his life. Some researchers have theorized that Castro, or elements within Cuban intelligence, might have decided that removing Kennedy would eliminate the primary threat to Cuba's survival. If Kennedy were removed and replaced with a different president, the theory goes American policy toward Cuba might change. A new administration might be less aggressive in pursuing anti-Castro operations. A new administration might be more willing to negotiate with Cuba or to accept Castro's government as a permanent fixture in the Western Hemisphere. Lee Harvey Oswald's pro-Castro sympathies and his attempt to reach Cuba in the weeks before the assassination have been cited as evidence of possible Cuban involvement. Oswald had publicly expressed support for Fidel Castro and for the Cuban Revolution. He had distributed Fair Play for Cuba leaflets in New Orleans. In August 1963, Oswald visited the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, seeking a visa that would allow him to travel to Cuba. His stated intention was to travel to Cuba and then to the Soviet Union. The Cuban government denied him a visa. Some investigators have suggested that Oswald might have been recruited by Cuban intelligence during his visit to the Cuban embassy. The theory suggests that Cuban intelligence officers, recognizing Oswald as a man with access to classified information and with pro-Castro sympathies, might have recruited him as an agent. However, declassified documents from the Cuban government released decades later suggest a different picture. These documents indicate that Castro was actually concerned about being blamed for Kennedy's death and took steps to distance Cuba from any involvement in the assassination. The documents suggest that Cuban intelligence officers were suspicious of Oswald when he visited the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. They questioned whether he was a genuine defector or an American spy attempting to infiltrate Cuba. They were concerned that allowing Oswald to travel to Cuba might compromise Cuban security. The decision to deny Oswald a visa appears to have been based on these security concerns rather than on a decision to recruit him as an agent. Castro himself, in interviews conducted in the 1990s, denied any involvement in the assassination. Castro expressed surprise at Kennedy's death. Castro stated that he had not anticipated the assassination and had not been involved in planning it. Castro acknowledged that he had reasons to want Kennedy removed, but he denied that Cuba had taken action to accomplish this. Castro's statements suggest that while he may have had motive, he did not act on that motive. Whether Castro's statements can be trusted remains a matter of debate. Castro had every reason to deny involvement in the assassination, even if Cuba had been involved. However, the absence of any declassified evidence suggesting Cuban government involvement in the assassination lends credibility to Castro's denials. The question of whether rogue elements within Cuban intelligence might have acted independently remains more difficult to answer. Cuban intelligence agencies were not monolithic organizations. Different divisions and different officers might have had different objectives and different levels of commitment to various operations. It is theoretically possible that elements within Cuban intelligence, frustrated by Castro's caution or by the continued threat posed by American operations, might have decided to act independently to remove Kennedy. However, no evidence has emerged to support this theory. No declassified documents have revealed evidence of rogue Cuban intelligence operations against Kennedy. No witnesses have come forward with credible accounts of Cuban involvement in the assassination. The theory of Cuban involvement in the assassination faces significant evidentiary challenges. Oswald had no documented connections to Cuban intelligence officers other than his visit to the Cuban embassy in Mexico City. The CIA's surveillance of Oswald in Mexico City, while incomplete, did not reveal any evidence of recruitment by Cuban intelligence. Oswald's movements and associations in the weeks before the assassination do not suggest Cuban intelligence involvement. The absence of any credible evidence of Cuban involvement, combined with Castro's apparent concern about being blamed for the assassination, suggests that Cuba was not involved in planning or executing the assassination. Yet the question of Cuban motive remains significant. Castro had clear motive to want Kennedy removed. Castro had the means to conduct such an operation, given Cuba's intelligence capabilities and its connections to various international actors. Castro had demonstrated willingness to take risks in pursuit of his objectives. However, the available evidence suggests that Castro was more concerned about being implicated in Kennedy's death than about committing the act. Castro understood that if Cuba were blamed for Kennedy's assassination, the United States would have justification for military invasion of Cuba. Castro understood that American military power was vastly superior to Cuba's military capabilities. Castro understood that American invasion of Cuba would likely result in his overthrow and possibly in his death. From this perspective, Castro's apparent concern about being blamed for the assassination makes sense. Castro may have had motive to want Kennedy dead, but he had even stronger motive to avoid being implicated in the assassination. The question remains whether rogue elements within Cuban intelligence might have acted independently of Castro's knowledge or approval. Intelligence agencies sometimes conduct operations that their political leaders are not fully informed about. Officers within intelligence agencies sometimes pursue objectives that diverge from official government policy. It is theoretically possible that Cuban intelligence officers frustrated by American operations against Cuba and believing that Kennedy's removal would benefit Cuba might have decided to act independently. However, without evidence of such operations, this remains speculation. The available evidence suggests that Cuba was not involved in the assassination, though the question of what Castro knew, and when he knew it, may never be definitively answered. As we continue to examine the evidence and the various theories about the assassination, we will see how the absence of definitive proof has allowed multiple theories to persist, and how the question of international involvement complicates the assassination narrative. The Zapruder film, visual evidence and interpretation. We have examined various theories about who might have been responsible for the assassination, yet the most compelling evidence remains the visual record captured on film. On November 22, 1963, a Dallas businessman named Abraham Zapruder stood on the grassy knoll overlooking Dealey Plaza with an 8mm home movie camera. He had decided that morning to bring his camera to film the presidential motorcade. His decision to bring that camera and his presence at that particular location at that particular moment would result in the creation of the most important piece of evidence in the assassination investigation. The 26-second film that Zapruder captured would become the subject of intense scrutiny, debate, and reanalysis for more than 6 decades. Abraham Zapruder was a businessman in the garment industry who lived in Dallas. He was not a professional filmmaker or a journalist. He was simply a citizen who wanted to film the president's motorcade as it passed through his city. Zapruder positioned himself on the grassy knoll, a small rise in Dealey Plaza that overlooked the motorcade route. His vantage point gave him a clear view of the presidential limousine as it moved through the plaza. He held his camera steady and filmed as the motorcade approached. The film he captured shows the motorcade moving slowly through Dealey Plaza. It shows President Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy in the back seat. It shows Governor Connolly and his wife in front of them. It shows the exact moment when Kennedy is struck by bullets. It shows the reactions of those in and around the limousine. It shows the motorcade accelerating away from the plaza. For years after the assassination, the Zapruder film was held by Life magazine and shown only to select audiences. Life magazine purchased the film from Zapruder for $150,000, a substantial sum at the time. The magazine controlled access to the film and determined who could view it and under what circumstances. The Warren Commission was allowed to view the film, but the general public was not. Researchers and investigators had to request special permission to view the film. This restricted access meant that the film remained largely unknown to the American public for more than a decade after the assassination. The public knew that such a film existed, but most Americans had never seen it. In the 1970s, the Zapruder film was finally released to the public. The film was shown on television and became available for purchase. The general public could now see for themselves what the film showed. The release of the film to the public sparked intense scrutiny and debate. Researchers began to analyze the film frame by frame, looking for details that might shed light on what happened during those crucial seconds in Dealey Plaza. The film became central to the assassination debate. Every theory about the assassination had to account for what the Zapruder film showed. One of the most controversial aspects of the Zapruder film involves the movement of President Kennedy's head after the fatal shot. The film appears to show Kennedy's head moving backward after he is struck by the fatal bullet. If the fatal shot came from behind, as the Warren Commission concluded Kennedy's head should have moved forward, away from the direction of the shot, the backward motion of Kennedy's head seemed to some observers to suggest that the fatal shot came from the front, not from behind. This would indicate a second shooter positioned in front of the motorcade, possibly on the grassy knoll. The backward head movement became a central point of contention in the assassination debate. The Warren Commission's experts argued that the backward head movement could be explained by neuromuscular reaction. When the brain is severely damaged by a gunshot, wound muscles can contract involuntarily, causing the body to move in unexpected directions. The Commission's experts argued that this neuromuscular reaction could explain Kennedy's backward head movement despite the shot coming from behind. However, independent experts have questioned this explanation. Some have argued that neuromuscular reaction would not be strong enough to cause such a dramatic backward movement of the head. Some have argued that the backward movement is more consistent with the shot from the front. The debate about what the backward head movement means has continued for decades. The Zapruder film also shows the exact positions of Kennedy and Connolly at the moment of impact. This information has been crucial to ballistics experts attempting to calculate the trajectory of the bullets. The film shows the angle at which Kennedy was sitting, the angle at which Connolly was sitting, and the relative positions of the two men. Using this information, ballistics experts have attempted to determine whether a single bullet could have struck both men or whether separate bullets were required. The single bullet theory depends heavily on the positions shown in the Zapruder film. If the positions shown in the film are consistent with the single bullet theory, then the theory is plausible. If the positions are inconsistent with the theory, then the theory is implausible. However, the film's quality and the angles involved make definitive conclusions difficult. The Zapruder film was shot with an 8mm home movie camera, not a professional film camera. The image quality is grainy by modern standards. The camera angle is fixed. Zapruder could not pan or zoom to follow the action. The film shows the motorcade from a particular angle and distance, which limits the information that can be extracted from it. Ballistics experts, attempting to calculate bullet trajectories from the film, must make assumptions about the exact positions of Kennedy and Connolly, the exact angle of the shots, and the exact behavior of the bullets. Different experts making different assumptions have reached different conclusions about what the film shows. The House Select Committee on Assassinations, which reopened the investigation in 1976, commissioned computer analysis of the Zapruder film. The committee's experts used early computer technology to enhance the film and to analyze the positions and movements shown in it. The committee's analysis concluded that the evidence was consistent with shots from both the Texas School Book Depository and the Grassy Knoll. This conclusion suggested that there were multiple shooters and therefore a conspiracy. However, subsequent analysis has questioned the committee's conclusions. Some experts have argued that the computer analysis was flawed, or that the conclusions drawn from the analysis were not fully supported by the data. More recent digital analysis has attempted to clarify the trajectory questions and to provide definitive answers about what the Zapruder film shows. Modern digital technology allows for much more sophisticated analysis than was possible in the 1970s. Researchers have used digital enhancement techniques to clarify details in the film. They have used computer modeling to simulate bullet trajectories and to test whether the single bullet theory is consistent with the positions shown in the film. They have analyzed the backward head movement frame by frame, attempting to determine whether it is consistent with a shot from behind or whether it suggests a shot from the front. Yet despite all this analysis and reanalysis, experts continue to disagree about what the Zapruder film shows. The film has been enhanced, analyzed, and reanalyzed countless times using increasingly sophisticated technology. Yet it continues to generate debate rather than definitive answers. Different experts examining the same film with the same technology reach different conclusions based on different assumptions and different interpretive frameworks. Some experts conclude that the film is consistent with the Warren Commission's conclusion that Oswald acted alone. Other experts conclude that the film is consistent with a conspiracy involving multiple shooters. The Zapruder film illustrates a fundamental challenge in historical investigation. Physical evidence, while concrete and seemingly objective, requires interpretation. The interpretation of evidence depends on assumptions about how the evidence was created and how it should be analyzed. Different experts examining the same evidence can reach different conclusions based on different assumptions. The Zapruder film is simultaneously the most important piece of evidence in the assassination investigation and the most contested. What the film shows depends partly on what viewers expect to see, making it a fascinating case study in how evidence can be interpreted through different analytical frameworks. The film also illustrates the importance of access to evidence. For more than a decade after the assassination, the Zapruder film was held by Life magazine and shown only to select audiences. This restricted access meant that the public could not examine the evidence for themselves. The public had to rely on descriptions of the film provided by others. When the film was finally released to the public in the 1970s, it sparked new investigation and new debate. The public could now see for themselves what the film showed and could form their own conclusions about what it meant. The release of the film to the public was crucial to the reopening of the assassination investigation in the 1970s. The Zapruder film remains central to any understanding of the Kennedy assassination. It provides the most complete visual record of the assassination. It shows the exact positions of Kennedy and Connolly at the moment of impact. It shows the reactions of those present. It shows the backward movement of Kennedy's head that has sparked so much debate. Yet the film does not provide definitive answers about what happened. Instead, it provides evidence that can be interpreted in different ways depending on one's assumptions and analytical framework. As we continue to examine other evidence and other aspects of the assassination, we will see how the Zapruder film connects to broader questions about the assassination and how the interpretation of evidence shapes our understanding of historical events. The Grassy Knoll, the second shooter theory. The Zapruder film provided visual evidence that could be interpreted in multiple ways, yet it was not the only evidence, suggesting that shots may have come from directions other than the Texas schoolbook depository. Immediately after the assassination, numerous witnesses reported hearing shots from the direction of the Grassy Knoll, a small rise in front of the motorcade's path. Some witnesses reported seeing a puff of smoke in that location. Some reported seeing a figure with a rifle. These accounts made in the immediate aftermath of the assassination, when memories were fresh, suggested to many observers that a second shooter may have been positioned on the Grassy Knoll. The question of whether a shooter was actually present on the Grassy Knoll has become one of the most debated aspects of the assassination investigation. The Grassy Knoll is a small rise in Dealey Plaza, located in front of the motorcade's path as it moved through the plaza. The knoll is bordered by trees and a wooden fence. Behind the fence is a parking area. The knoll overlooks the motorcade route and would provide a clear vantage point for a shooter wanting to fire at the presidential limousine. In the immediate aftermath of the assassination, several witnesses reported seeing suspicious activity on or near the Grassy Knoll. A railroad worker employed by the Union Terminal Company reported seeing a man with a rifle on the knoll. A woman in the motorcade reported seeing a shooter on the knoll. Several other witnesses reported hearing shots that seemed to come from the direction of the knoll rather than from the Texas schoolbook depository behind the motorcade. The Warren Commission examined these witness accounts and concluded that they were mistaken. The commission argued that witnesses were confused about the direction of sound. Sound travels unpredictably in urban environments, bouncing off buildings and creating confusion about its source. The commission argued that all witnesses who reported hearing shots from the Grassy Knoll were actually hearing echoes of shots fired from the Texas schoolbook depository. The commission concluded that all shots came from the depository and that there was no shooter on the Grassy Knoll. However, the commission did not thoroughly investigate the Grassy Knoll or interview all witnesses who reported seeing suspicious activity there. In 1979, more than 15 years after the assassination, the House Select Committee on Assassinations reopened the investigation. The committee examined new evidence and re-examined evidence that the Warren Commission had considered. One significant piece of evidence that the committee examined was acoustic evidence from a police dictabelt recording made during the motorcade. A Dallas police officer had his radio transmitter activated during the assassination, and the police dispatcher's radio recorded the sounds picked up by the officer's transmitter. This recording captured ambient sound from Dealey Plaza during the assassination, including the sounds of the gunshots. The House Select Committee on Assassinations commissioned acoustic experts to analyze the police dictabelt recording. The committee's acoustic experts examined the recording and identified what they believed were gunshots. The experts concluded that the recording contained evidence of 4 shots. The Warren Commission had concluded that 3 shots were fired. If 4 shots were fired, then at least 2 shooters must have been involved, suggesting a conspiracy. The acoustic experts further concluded that one of the 4 shots likely came from the Grassy Knoll, based on the timing and characteristics of the acoustic impulses. This finding was significant because it suggested that the Warren Commission's conclusion that Oswald acted alone was incorrect. If a second shooter was indeed present on the Grassy Knoll, then a conspiracy was involved in the assassination. The House Select Committee on Assassinations concluded based on the acoustic evidence and other factors that a conspiracy was likely involved in the assassination. This conclusion directly contradicted the Warren Commission's finding that Oswald acted alone. However, subsequent analysis of the acoustic evidence has been contested. Some experts have argued that the impulses identified as gunshots by the House Committee's acoustic experts were actually motorcycle backfires, echoes of gunshots, or other noise. In 1982, the National Academy of Sciences commissioned a review of the acoustic evidence. The Academy's experts reanalyzed the police dictabelt recording and concluded that the acoustic evidence did not definitively support the conclusion that 4 shots were fired, or that a shot came from the Grassy Knoll. The Academy's experts argued that the impulses identified by the House Committee could have been caused by various sources, and that the evidence was not conclusive. The debate about the acoustic evidence has continued for decades. Some experts maintain that the acoustic evidence is consistent with the second shooter on the Grassy Knoll. Other experts argue that the acoustic evidence is inconclusive, or that it does not support the conclusion of a second shooter. The disagreement among experts reflects the difficulty of drawing definitive conclusions from acoustic evidence. Sound recordings can be ambiguous, and different experts analyzing the same recording can reach different conclusions about what the recording shows. Witness testimony about the Grassy Knoll has also been questioned and re-examined. Some witnesses may have been confused about the direction of sound, or their memories may have been influenced by subsequent discussions and media coverage. In the days and weeks following the assassination, there was extensive media coverage and public discussion about the assassination. Witnesses' memories of events may have been influenced by what they heard from others or read in newspapers. Some witnesses may have changed their accounts over time as their memories evolved or as they were influenced by subsequent information. However, some witnesses were remarkably consistent in their accounts of seeing suspicious activity on the Grassy Knoll. A railroad worker named S.M. Holland reported seeing a man with a rifle on the Grassy Knoll. Holland was a credible witness employed by the railroad, and his account was consistent and detailed. A woman named Jean Hill, who was in the motorcade, reported seeing a shooter on the knoll. Hill's account was also consistent and detailed. These accounts, while not definitive proof of a second shooter, suggest that at least some credible observers believe they saw a shooter on the Grassy Knoll. The question of whether a puff of smoke was visible on the Grassy Knoll has also been debated. Several witnesses reported seeing a puff of smoke in the area of the Grassy Knoll. Some researchers have interpreted this as evidence of a shot fired from that location. However, other researchers have argued that the puff of smoke could have been caused by various sources, including exhaust from motorcycles or other vehicles, or could have been a misperception by witnesses. The interpretation of witness accounts regarding smoke is subjective and depends on one's assumptions about what witnesses saw and what caused the smoke. The Warren Commission's dismissal of Grassy Knoll witnesses has been criticized by researchers who believe that the commission was not sufficiently thorough in investigating these accounts. The commission did not conduct independent ballistics tests to determine whether a shot fired from the Grassy Knoll would have been audible or visible from various locations in Dealey Plaza. The commission did not thoroughly interview all witnesses who reported seeing suspicious activity on the knoll. The commission seemed to assume that all witnesses were mistaken, rather than investigating whether any of them might have actually seen a second shooter. The grassy knoll represents the most tangible physical location associated with the theory of a second shooter. The knoll provides a clear vantage point for a shooter. The knoll is located in front of the motorcade's path, which would be consistent with the backward movement of Kennedy's head that some observers interpreted as evidence of a shot from the front. The knoll is bordered by trees and a fence, which would provide cover for a shooter. The presence of credible witnesses who reported seeing suspicious activity on the knoll adds to the plausibility of the theory that a second shooter was present there. However, the evidence for a second shooter on the grassy knoll remains circumstantial and contested. The acoustic evidence is ambiguous and subject to different interpretations. Witness testimony is subject to the limitations and fallibilities of human memory and perception. No physical evidence, such as shell casings or a weapon, has been recovered from the grassy knoll. No photograph or film has captured a clear image of a second shooter on the knoll. The Zapruder film, the most complete visual record of the assassination, does not show a clear image of a shooter on the grassy knoll, though some researchers have argued that the film is consistent with a shot from that direction. The grassy knoll remains one of the most intriguing and controversial aspects of the assassination investigation. The location, the witness accounts, and the acoustic evidence all suggest the possibility of a second shooter. Yet the evidence is not conclusive, and experts continue to disagree about what the evidence shows. The grassy knoll represents the most tangible physical evidence for a conspiracy, yet the evidence remains circumstantial and contested. The acoustic data and witness accounts are intriguing, but not conclusive. As we continue to examine other evidence and other aspects of the assassination, we will see how the question of a second shooter on the grassy knoll connects to broader questions about whether the assassination involved a conspiracy, and if so, who might have been involved in that conspiracy. Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner, and the silencing of Oswald. We have examined the physical evidence, the official investigation, and various theories about potential conspirators. Yet one figure stands at the intersection of all these elements: Jack Ruby, the man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald. Ruby's action on November 24, 1963, just 2 days after the assassination, silenced the one person who might have provided definitive answers about what happened in Dealey Plaza. Understanding Ruby requires us to examine his background, his connections to organized crime and law enforcement, and the circumstances surrounding his killing of Oswald. The question of Ruby's motivations remains one of the most contested aspects of the assassination narrative. Jack Ruby was born Jacob Rubenstein in Chicago on March 25, 1911. He grew up in a poor neighborhood on Chicago's west side. His father was a carpenter. His mother worked as a seamstress. The family struggled financially throughout Ruby's childhood. Ruby had limited formal education and left school at an early age. As a young man, Ruby became involved in various criminal enterprises in Chicago. He worked as a boxer, a musician, and a small-time criminal. He was arrested multiple times for various offenses, including disorderly conduct and carrying a concealed weapon. Ruby developed connections to organized crime figures in Chicago during this period. He was known to associate with mob-connected individuals and to participate in various underworld activities. In 1947, Ruby moved to Dallas, Texas. The reasons for his move are not entirely clear. Some accounts suggest that Ruby was fleeing legal troubles in Chicago. Other accounts suggest that Ruby was seeking new opportunities in Dallas. Whatever his motivations, Ruby settled in Dallas and began to establish himself in the local underworld. He became a nightclub owner, operating the Carousel Club, a strip club located in downtown Dallas. The Carousel Club became a gathering place for Dallas police officers, politicians, and various underworld figures. Ruby was known for his volatile temperament and his close relationships with Dallas law enforcement. Ruby's relationship with Dallas police was unusual and significant. Police officers frequented the Carousel Club where they received free drinks and other favors from Ruby. Ruby cultivated these relationships carefully, understanding that connections to law enforcement could be valuable for his business and his personal safety. Ruby was known to the Dallas police, and they were known to him. This relationship would become significant in the context of the assassination and Ruby's subsequent killing of Oswald. Ruby's personal life was marked by instability and emotional turbulence. He had multiple romantic relationships, but never married. He was known to be impulsive and prone to violent outbursts. He had a volatile temper and was quick to anger. He was also known to be sentimental and emotional, particularly regarding patriotic and political matters. Friends and acquaintances described Ruby as a man of contradictions, capable of both kindness and violence, both loyalty and betrayal. Ruby's emotional state in the days following Kennedy's assassination was reportedly one of deep distress and grief. On November 22, 1963, Ruby was in his nightclub when he learned of President Kennedy's assassination. According to his own account, he was devastated by the news. He closed his nightclub as a sign of respect and spent the evening watching television coverage of the assassination and its aftermath. Ruby was reportedly deeply affected by the death of the president and by the sight of Jackie Kennedy cradling her dying husband. Ruby claimed that he was overcome with emotion and with a sense of patriotic duty. He reportedly said that he wanted to do something to help the nation during this time of crisis. On November the 24th, 1963, 2 days after the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald was being transferred from the Dallas Police Department to the county jail. The transfer was scheduled for mid-morning. Police planned to move Oswald through the basement of the police building to a waiting vehicle. The basement was a secure area theoretically accessible only to authorized personnel. However, security was relatively loose and the police had not implemented strict access controls. Journalists and other individuals were present in the basement, waiting to photograph and film Oswald's transfer. Jack Ruby appeared in the basement at approximately 11:20 a.m., just as Oswald was being brought out for transfer. Ruby was carrying a .38 caliber revolver. As Oswald was being escorted through the basement by police officers, Ruby pushed through the crowd and fired a single shot at close range. The bullet struck Oswald in the abdomen. Oswald was rushed to Parkland Hospital, the same hospital where President Kennedy had died 2 days earlier. Oswald died from his wound within hours. The shooting was broadcast live on television, making it the first murder witnessed by millions of Americans simultaneously. Ruby's action in killing Oswald raised immediate questions. How did Ruby gain access to a secure police basement? Why was he there at that precise moment? Ruby claimed that he had gone to the police building to deliver sandwiches to police officers, as he sometimes did. He claimed that he had wandered into the basement by chance and had spontaneously decided to shoot Oswald when he saw him. Ruby claimed that he acted out of rage at Kennedy's death and a desire to spare Jackie Kennedy the ordeal of a trial in which she would have to testify about the assassination. However, Ruby's presence in the police basement at that precise moment raised suspicions. How did Ruby know exactly when Oswald would be transferred? How did he know the route that Oswald would take? How did he manage to get past police security and into the basement? These questions suggested to some observers that Ruby's action was not spontaneous, but rather planned. Some researchers have theorized that Ruby was connected to organized crime figures who wanted Oswald's silence before he could reveal details about a larger conspiracy. If Oswald had testified at trial, the theory goes he might have revealed connections to organized crime or other conspirators. By killing Oswald, Ruby ensured that Oswald would never testify. The theory of mob involvement in Ruby's killing of Oswald is based on several factors. Ruby had connections to organized crime figures in Dallas and Chicago. Organized crime had documented motives for wanting Kennedy dead. Organized crime had demonstrated capacity for violence and for eliminating witnesses. Ruby's sudden appearance in the police basement at the precise moment of Oswald's transfer seemed too coincidental to some observers. The security breach that allowed Ruby to reach Oswald seemed suspicious. Some researchers have suggested that Ruby was acting on behalf of organized crime figures who wanted Oswald silenced. However, other researchers argue that Ruby's explanation was genuine. Ruby was known to be an emotional and impulsive man. Ruby was reportedly deeply affected by Kennedy's death. Ruby may have genuinely acted spontaneously driven by emotion rather than by conspiracy. Ruby's relationship with Dallas police may have given him knowledge of when Oswald would be transferred, and may have made it easier for him to gain access to the basement without this necessarily indicating a conspiracy. The security breach that allowed Ruby to reach Oswald may have been the result of police negligence rather than deliberate cooperation with Ruby. Ruby was arrested and charged with the murder of Oswald. He was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. However, Ruby's conviction was overturned on appeal, and he was granted a new trial. Before the new trial could take place, Ruby died in prison on January 3, 1967. Ruby was suffering from cancer and his health declined rapidly in his final months. Before his death, Ruby made statements suggesting that he was part of a conspiracy. He claimed that there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, and that he was involved in it. However, Ruby provided no details about the conspiracy, or about who else was involved. His death prevented any definitive answers about his true motivations, and about whether he was acting independently or on behalf of others. Ruby's killing of Oswald remains one of the most suspicious elements of the assassination narrative. Whether Ruby was a patriotic vigilante overcome by emotion and a sense of duty, or whether he was a mob operative, silencing a witness, his actions ensured that Oswald would never testify about what he knew or didn't know. Oswald never had the opportunity to answer questions about his background, his associations, his possible involvement with intelligence agencies, or his knowledge of the assassination. The public never heard Oswald's testimony under oath. The public never had the opportunity to evaluate Oswald's credibility or to hear his account of events. Ruby's action silenced the primary suspect in the assassination and prevented the public from ever knowing what Oswald might have revealed. The circumstances surrounding Ruby's killing of Oswald, his access to a secure police basement, his presence at the precise moment of transfer, his connection to organized crime, and his subsequent claims of conspiracy involvement all suggest that more may have been involved than a simple act of emotional vigilantism. Yet the evidence does not definitively prove that Ruby was acting on behalf of organized crime or that he was part of a larger conspiracy. Ruby's explanation of spontaneous action driven by emotion cannot be definitively ruled out. The truth about Ruby's motivations may lie somewhere between these two interpretations, or it may never be fully known. What is certain is that Ruby's action had profound consequences for the assassination investigation and for the public's ability to understand what actually happened on November 22, 1963. As we examine what has been revealed through declassified documents and subsequent investigations, we will see how the absence of Oswald's testimony has complicated the search for truth about the assassination. Declassified documents. What the government revealed. Jack Ruby's silencing of Oswald meant that crucial questions about the assassination would never be answered through direct testimony. Yet over the decades following the assassination, another avenue for understanding what happened emerged: the gradual release of classified government documents. For decades after the assassination, crucial documents remained classified and hidden from public view. Government agencies withheld information from investigators, from the public, and from each other. The reasons for this secrecy varied. Some documents were classified for legitimate national security reasons. Other documents were withheld because they revealed institutional failures or embarrassing information about government agencies. The gradual release of these documents beginning in the 1970s and accelerating in subsequent decades has revealed significant gaps in the Warren Commission's investigation and has raised new questions about what government officials knew and when they knew it. The Freedom of Information Act passed by Congress in 1966 established a legal mechanism for citizens to request access to classified government documents. The act required government agencies to release documents upon request, with certain exceptions for national security, personal privacy, and other sensitive matters. Following the passage of the Freedom of Information Act, researchers and journalists began to request documents related to the Kennedy assassination. Government agencies began reluctantly and gradually to release documents that had been classified. The release of these documents revealed information that had not been available to the Warren Commission or to the public. The FBI had been monitoring Lee Harvey Oswald since his return from the Soviet Union in 1962. The agency maintained an extensive file on Oswald, documenting his movements, his associations, and his activities. The FBI conducted surveillance of Oswald in Dallas and in New Orleans. The FBI interviewed Oswald after his return from the Soviet Union. The FBI was aware of Oswald's pro-Castro sympathies and that his involvement with pro-Castro organizations. However, the FBI did not fully disclose the extent of its surveillance of Oswald to the Warren Commission. The Commission knew that the FBI had been monitoring Oswald, but the Commission did not have access to the full scope of the FBI's files on Oswald. The withholding of this information meant that the Commission's investigation was based on incomplete information about Oswald's activities and associations. The CIA had conducted surveillance of Oswald in Mexico City in October 1963, approximately 6 weeks before the assassination. Oswald had traveled to Mexico City and visited the Soviet embassy and the Cuban embassy, seeking visas that would allow him to travel to Cuba and then to the Soviet Union. The CIA maintained surveillance operations in Mexico City and was aware of Oswald's visits to these embassies. The agency photographed individuals entering and leaving the embassies. The agency monitored communications from the embassies. The CIA was aware of Oswald's presence in Mexico City and of his attempts to obtain visas. However, the CIA did not fully disclose the details of its surveillance of Oswald to the Warren Commission. The Commission was not provided with complete information about Oswald's activities in Mexico City or about what the CIA had learned from its surveillance. Declassified documents revealed that the CIA had been involved in multiple assassination plots against Fidel Castro. These plots were conducted as part of Operation Mongoose and other covert operations against Cuba. The CIA had partnered with organized crime figures, including Sam Giancana and John Roselli, to plan and execute assassination attempts against Castro. The agency had developed various methods for killing Castro, including poisoning explosives and firearms. These assassination plots were conducted without the knowledge or approval of President Kennedy, though they were authorized by the Eisenhower administration and continued under Kennedy. The information about these assassination plots was not available to the Warren Commission. The Commission did not know about the CIA's partnerships with organized crime figures or about the agency's assassination plots against Castro. The withholding of information about CIA assassination plots against Castro was particularly significant because it revealed a connection between the CIA and organized crime figures who also had grievances against President Kennedy. If the Warren Commission had known about these partnerships, the Commission might have investigated whether organized crime figures, angered by the failed Castro plots and by Robert Kennedy's prosecutions, might have orchestrated Kennedy's assassination. The absence of this information from the Commission's investigation meant that a potential avenue of investigation was not pursued. The FBI had extensive files on organized crime figures with documented grievances against the Kennedys. The FBI maintained surveillance of mob figures and had information about their activities, their associations, and their statements. The FBI had information about threats made against President Kennedy by organized crime figures. The FBI had information about the connections between organized crime and the CIA regarding anti-Castro operations. However, the full scope of these files was not shared with the Warren Commission. The Commission did not have access to complete information about organized crime's possible motives for wanting Kennedy dead, or about the connections between organized crime and intelligence agencies. The withholding of information from the Warren Commission was not necessarily the result of deliberate conspiracy or intentional deception. Rather, it reflected the compartmentalized structure of government agencies and the institutional interest that agencies had in protecting their own operations and reputations. The FBI did not want to reveal the full extent of its surveillance operations, as this might have raised questions about the legality or appropriateness of the surveillance. The CIA did not want to reveal its assassination plots against Castro or its partnerships with organized crime figures, as this would have been embarrassing and potentially illegal. Different agencies had different interests in what information was disclosed and what information was withheld. In 1992, Congress passed the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act. This legislation mandated that all government documents related to the assassination be released to the public by January 1, 2017. The act created the Assassination Records Review Board, an independent agency tasked with reviewing classified documents and determining whether they should be released or whether they should remain classified for legitimate national security reasons. The review board released millions of pages of documents over the following decades. These documents provided researchers with access to information that had been withheld for decades. The declassified documents have allowed researchers to construct a more complete picture of the intelligence community's activities in the years before the assassination. Researchers have been able to trace the connections between different government agencies and between government agencies and private actors. Researchers have been able to identify gaps in the Warren Commission's investigation and to understand why those gaps existed. The declassified documents have revealed the extent to which institutional interests influenced what information was shared with investigators and what information was withheld. However, not all documents have been released. Some documents remain partially redacted with certain passages blacked out to protect national security or to protect individuals' privacy. Some documents remain classified with the government, arguing that their release would compromise national security. The deadline for releasing all documents, originally set for January 1, 2017, has been extended multiple times. As of the present day, some documents related to the assassination remain classified or partially redacted. This continued withholding of information has fueled speculation that the government is hiding something significant about the assassination. The declassified documents have revealed several specific pieces of information that were not available to the Warren Commission. Documents have revealed that the FBI had conducted more extensive surveillance of Oswald than the Commission knew. Documents have revealed details about CIA surveillance of Oswald in Mexico City. Documents have revealed information about CIA assassination plots against Castro and about the agency's partnerships with organized crime figures. Documents have revealed information about FBI surveillance of organized crime figures and about threats made against President Kennedy. These revelations have suggested that the Warren Commission's investigation was incomplete and that a more thorough investigation might have reached different conclusions. The declassified documents have also revealed the extent to which different government agencies were pursuing contradictory objectives without full coordination or oversight. The CIA was conducting assassination plots against Castro, while the Kennedy administration was pursuing diplomatic initiatives regarding Cuba. The FBI was prosecuting organized crime figures, while the CIA was partnering with those same figures for anti-Castro operations. Different divisions within the same agency were sometimes pursuing contradictory objectives without full knowledge of each other's activities. This compartmentalization meant that no single individual or agency had a complete picture of what was happening. The significance of the declassified documents lies not necessarily in any single revelation, but in the cumulative picture they provide of government secrecy and institutional interests influencing the investigation. The documents demonstrate that the Warren Commission operated with incomplete information. They demonstrate that government agencies withheld information from the Commission, whether by design or institutional compartmentalization. They demonstrate that the full scope of government activities related to Cuba, organized crime, and intelligence operations was not available to the Commission. They suggest that a fuller investigation with access to all available information might have reached different conclusions about the assassination. The declassified documents also raise questions about what information remains classified. If government agencies withheld so much information from the Warren Commission and from the public, what else might be hidden? Are there documents that remain classified that would provide definitive answers about the assassination? These questions have fueled ongoing speculation and conspiracy theories about the assassination. The continued withholding of some documents, even decades after the assassination, has suggested to some observers that the government is hiding something significant. Whether this is true, or whether the remaining classified documents simply contain information that is legitimately sensitive, remains unclear. As we examine what we have learned from declassified documents and what questions remain unanswered, we will see how the gradual release of information has changed our understanding of the assassination and of the government's role in investigating it. Forensic reanalysis, modern technology, and old questions. The declassified documents have provided new information about what government agencies knew and when they knew it, yet they have not definitively answered the central questions about the assassination. Another avenue for understanding what happened has emerged through advances in forensic science and technology. Researchers have used modern tools to re-examine evidence collected in 1963, applying techniques and analytical methods that were not available at the time of the original investigation. Computer modeling, digital enhancement, refined acoustic analysis, and sophisticated ballistics testing have all been brought to bear on the assassination evidence. Yet despite all these technological advances, the fundamental questions remain contested. Modern technology has clarified some details, while raising new questions, suggesting that the limitations of evidence may be more fundamental than the limitations of technology. Advances in computer technology have allowed researchers to create detailed, three-dimensional models of Dealey Plaza and to simulate bullet trajectories based on the known positions of Kennedy Connolly and the alleged shooters. Researchers have used the Zapruder film to determine the exact positions of the president and the governor at various moments during the assassination. They have used architectural surveys of Dealey Plaza to determine the exact positions from which shots could have been fired. They have used ballistics principles to calculate the trajectory that a bullet would follow if fired from the Texas Schoolbook Depository or from the Grassy Knoll. Computer modeling has allowed researchers to test whether the single bullet theory is consistent with the positions shown in the Zapruder film and with the known ballistics characteristics of the Mannlicher Carcano rifle. The results of computer modeling have been mixed. Some computer models suggest that the single bullet theory is plausible and consistent with the available evidence. Other computer models suggest that the single bullet theory is implausible and that the trajectory described by the Warren Commission is inconsistent with the known positions of Kennedy and Connolly. The differences in results reflect differences in the assumptions made by different researchers about the exact positions of Kennedy and Connolly, the exact angle of the shots, and the exact behavior of bullets as they pass through tissue and bone. Computer modeling has not definitively resolved the question of whether the single bullet theory is correct. Digital enhancement of the Zapruder film has clarified some details while raising new questions. Modern digital technology allows for much more sophisticated enhancement than was possible in the 1970s when the House Select Committee on Assassinations first commissioned analysis of the film. Researchers have used digital enhancement techniques to clarify the positions of Kennedy and Connolly, to enhance details of the background, and to analyze the movement of Kennedy's head after the fatal shot. Digital enhancement has revealed details that were not visible in the original film, allowing researchers to examine the assassination with greater precision than was previously possible. However, digital enhancement has also raised new questions about the interpretation of the film. Different researchers using the same digital enhancement techniques have reached different conclusions about what the film shows. Some researchers argue that the enhanced film is consistent with a shot from behind. Other researchers argue that the enhanced film is consistent with a shot from the front. The debate about what the Zapruder film shows has continued despite advances in digital technology. The film remains subject to interpretation, with different experts reaching different conclusions based on their assumptions about what the film depicts. Acoustic analysis has been refined and improved since the House Select Committee on Assassinations first commissioned analysis of the police dictabelt recording in the 1970s. Modern acoustic technology allows for more sophisticated analysis of sound recordings than was possible decades ago. Researchers have reanalyzed the police dictabelt recording, examining the acoustic impulses that were identified as gunshots. Some researchers have argued that the acoustic evidence supports the conclusion that 4 shots were fired, with 1 coming from the Grassy Knoll. Other researchers have argued that the acoustic evidence is inconclusive, or that the impulses identified as gunshots were actually caused by other sources. The National Academy of Sciences commissioned a review of the acoustic evidence in 1982, concluding that the acoustic analysis conducted by the House Select Committee on Assassinations was flawed, and that the acoustic evidence did not definitively support the conclusion of a second shooter. However, some researchers have disputed the Academy's conclusions, arguing that the Academy's analysis was itself flawed, and that the acoustic evidence does support the conclusion of a second shooter. The debate about the acoustic evidence has continued for decades, with experts disagreeing about what the police dictabelt recording shows and what conclusions can be drawn from it. Ballistics experts have conducted extensive testing of the Mannlicher Carcano rifle to determine whether it could have been fired 3 times in the time frame suggested by the Warren Commission. The Warren Commission concluded that Oswald fired 3 shots in approximately 5.6 seconds based on the timing of the Zapruder film. Some ballistics tests suggest that this was possible. Experts have demonstrated that the Mannlicher Carcano rifle, while not a particularly accurate or reliable weapon, could theoretically be fired 3 times in this time frame by someone with basic firearms training. However, other ballistics experts have argued that firing the rifle 3 times with the accuracy required by the Commission's theory in such a short time frame would have been difficult, even for an experienced marksman. The Mannlicher Carcano rifle has a slow rate of fire and requires the shooter to work the bolt between shots. The rifle is also known to be inaccurate at longer distances. The rifle's mechanical characteristics make it a poor choice for an assassination requiring precision and speed. Some ballistics experts have argued that the rifle's characteristics make it unlikely that Oswald could have fired 3 accurate shots in the time frame suggested by the Commission. Other experts have argued that while difficult, it was possible for someone with Oswald's level of firearms training to accomplish this feat. The debate about the rifle's capabilities has continued, with experts disagreeing about whether the rifle could have been used to accomplish what the commission concluded. Forensic pathologists have re-examined the autopsy photographs and X-rays, debating the location and trajectory of the fatal head wound. The autopsy was conducted at Bethesda Naval Hospital in Washington, D.C., on the evening of November 20, 1963. The autopsy was performed by military pathologists, not by civilian forensic experts. The autopsy report described the fatal head wound as being located in the back of Kennedy's head, consistent with a shot fired from behind. However, some forensic pathologists who have examined the autopsy photographs and X-rays have argued that the wound characteristics are more consistent with a shot from the front than with a shot from behind. The location and characteristics of the head wound have been the subject of intense debate. Some experts argue that the wound characteristics shown in the autopsy photographs and X-rays are consistent with the Warren Commission's conclusion that the fatal shot came from behind. Other experts argue that the wound characteristics suggest that the fatal shot came from the front. The debate has centered on the location of the wound, the size and shape of the wound, and the direction of the wound tracked through Kennedy's skull. Different experts examining the same autopsy materials have reached different conclusions based on their interpretation of the evidence. The House Select Committee on Assassinations commissioned extensive forensic analysis in the late 1970s. The committee's forensic experts re-examined the autopsy materials, the ballistics evidence, and other physical evidence. The committee's experts concluded that a conspiracy was likely based on the acoustic evidence and other factors. However, subsequent analysis has sometimes contradicted the committee's conclusions. Some experts have questioned the committee's interpretation of the acoustic evidence. Some experts have questioned the committee's conclusions about the ballistics evidence. The committee's work, while extensive, has not definitively resolved the fundamental questions about the assassination. Modern technology has provided more detailed information about the assassination evidence than was available in 1963 or even in the 1970s. Researchers have been able to examine the evidence with greater precision and sophistication than was previously possible. Computer modeling, digital enhancement, refined acoustic analysis, and sophisticated ballistics testing have all contributed to a more detailed understanding of the physical evidence. Yet despite all these technological advances, the fundamental questions remain contested. Different experts examining the same evidence with the same technology reach different conclusions based on their assumptions and interpretive frameworks. The persistence of disagreement among experts despite advances in technology suggests that the limitations may not be technological, but rather epistemological. The evidence may be inherently ambiguous, admitting multiple interpretations, depending on one's assumptions about how the evidence was created and how it should be analyzed. A researcher who assumes that Oswald acted alone will interpret the evidence differently than a researcher who assumes that a conspiracy was involved. A researcher who believes that the single bullet theory is plausible will interpret the ballistics evidence differently than a researcher who believes the theory is implausible. The interpretation of evidence is shaped not only by the evidence itself, but also by the assumptions and expectations that researchers bring to their analysis. Modern forensic science has clarified details, but has not definitively resolved the central questions about the assassination. The evidence remains subject to interpretation, suggesting that the truth about what happened on November 20, 1963 may depend on factors beyond what forensic analysis can determine. The physical evidence can tell us what happened in terms of trajectories, timing, and wound characteristics, but it cannot tell us the intentions of those involved or the larger context of events. Understanding the assassination requires not only forensic analysis, but also historical investigation, examination of institutional interests, and consideration of the broader political context of the early 1960s. As we move toward a final assessment of what we know and what remains unknown about the assassination, we will see how the various forms of evidence and analysis contribute to our understanding, while also revealing the limits of what evidence can tell us. Witness testimony, reliability, and contradiction. Modern forensic analysis has provided detailed information about the physical evidence, yet it cannot replace the human experience of witnessing events as they unfold. The Warren Commission interviewed numerous witnesses to the assassination, and their accounts provide a crucial window into what people actually saw and heard in Dealey Plaza on November 22, 1963. However, witness testimony presents a paradox. It is essential to understanding what happened. It is inherently unreliable. The accounts given by witnesses varied significantly, sometimes contradicting each other in fundamental ways. Understanding why witnesses disagreed and how to evaluate their accounts requires us to examine the nature of perception memory and the circumstances under which the assassination occurred. The Warren Commission interviewed 552 witnesses in total. These witnesses included people who were present in Dealey Plaza, police officers, medical personnel, journalists, and others who had information relevant to the assassination. The Commission attempted to reconcile the various accounts into a coherent narrative. However, the accounts varied significantly in important ways. Some witnesses reported hearing shots from the Texas School Book Depository located behind the motorcade. Other witnesses reported hearing shots from the Grassy Knoll located in front of the motorcade. Some witnesses reported seeing a man with a rifle on the 6th floor of the depository. Other witnesses reported seeing a man on the Grassy Knoll. Some witnesses reported seeing Oswald in the depository that day. Other witnesses reported seeing him elsewhere or were uncertain about his location. The variation in witness accounts is understandable given the circumstances. The assassination occurred in seconds in broad daylight, with crowds of people reacting in shock and confusion. People were not expecting to witness an assassination. They were not prepared to observe and remember details with the precision that would be expected of trained observers. The trauma of witnessing such an event affects memory and perception. People who witness violence often experience shock disorientation and difficulty in accurately perceiving what is happening. The human mind, when confronted with something unexpected and traumatic, does not always record details accurately. Memory is reconstructive rather than reproductive. People remember the gist of events rather than precise details. People's memories are influenced by their expectations, by what they are told happened, and by subsequent discussions and media coverage. Sound travels unpredictably in urban environments, making it difficult to determine the direction of gunshots. Buildings and other structures reflect sound, creating echoes that can confuse observers about the source of a sound. A person hearing gunshots in Dealey Plaza might perceive the shots as coming from one direction, when they actually came from another direction. The acoustic environment of Dealey Plaza, with its buildings and structures, would have made it particularly difficult for witnesses to accurately determine the direction of gunshots. Some witnesses may have been confused about the direction of sound. Other witnesses may have accurately perceived the direction of sound, but been unable to articulate their perception clearly or consistently. The inconsistencies in witness testimony have been used to support various theories about the assassination. Researchers who believe in a conspiracy point to witnesses who reported shots from the Grassy Knoll. These researchers argue that if witnesses heard shots from the Grassy Knoll, then a second shooter must have been present there. Researchers who support the official narrative point to witnesses who reported shots from the depository. These researchers argue that the majority of witnesses reported hearing shots from the depository, and that witnesses who reported Grassy Knoll shots were mistaken about the direction of sound. The same witness accounts are interpreted differently, depending on one's assumptions about what actually happened. Some witnesses changed their accounts over time. A witness might give one account immediately after the assassination, a different account to the Warren Commission months later, and yet another account to researchers years later. These changes in accounts could reflect the natural evolution of memory over time. As people think about events, their memories can change. People can become confused about details. People can be influenced by what they hear from others or read in newspapers. Some witnesses may have changed their accounts because they were influenced by subsequent discussions and media coverage. Other witnesses may have changed their accounts because their memories evolved as they thought more carefully about what they had witnessed. The Warren Commission attempted to reconcile the conflicting witness accounts by concluding that most witnesses were mistaken about the direction of shots, and that all shots came from the Texas School Book Depository. The commission argued that witnesses who reported hearing shots from the grassy knoll were confused about the direction of sound due to the acoustic environment of Dealey Plaza. The commission concluded that the majority of witnesses reported shots from the depository, and that this majority view should be accepted over the minority view of witnesses who reported grassy knoll shots. However, critics argue that the commission's approach was too dismissive of witnesses who reported grassy knoll shots. Critics argue that some of these witnesses were credible and that their accounts should not have been so readily dismissed. A railroad worker named S.M. Holland was positioned on the railroad overpass overlooking Dealey Plaza. Holland reported seeing a puff of smoke on the grassy knoll and hearing a shot from that direction. Holland was a credible witness employed by the railroad with no obvious reason to fabricate his account. Holland's account was consistent and detailed. Holland maintained his account over the years, not changing his story in response to media coverage or other influences. Holland's testimony suggests that at least some witnesses who reported grassy knoll activity were not simply confused about the direction of sound. A woman named Jean Hill was riding in the motorcade positioned where she had a clear view of the grassy knoll. Hill reported seeing a shooter on the knoll. Hill's account was also consistent and detailed. Hill maintained her account over the years. Hill's testimony, like Holland's, suggests that some witnesses who reported grassy knoll activity were not simply confused about the direction of sound, but may have actually observed a second shooter. However, other witnesses who were in positions to observe the grassy knoll did not report seeing a shooter there. Some witnesses who were close to the grassy knoll reported seeing nothing suspicious. The absence of corroborating accounts from other witnesses who were in positions to observe the grassy knoll raises questions about whether Holland and Hill actually saw a shooter or whether they misinterpreted what they saw. The challenge of evaluating witness testimony is that it provides crucial information while remaining inherently unreliable. A single witness account, no matter how credible, the witness cannot be definitively accepted or rejected without corroborating evidence. The Warren Commission's methodology for evaluating witness testimony has been criticized. The Commission seemed to accept accounts that supported the conclusion that Oswald acted alone and to reject accounts that suggested a conspiracy. Critics argue that the Commission's approach was biased toward reaching a predetermined conclusion rather than objectively evaluating the evidence. However, the Commission's approach of accepting the majority view of witnesses could also be justified as a reasonable way to evaluate conflicting accounts. When witnesses disagree, it is reasonable to give more weight to the majority view, assuming that the majority of witnesses are more likely to be correct than the minority. The challenge of evaluating witness testimony is fundamental to historical investigation. Witness testimony is essential to understanding what happened, yet it is inherently unreliable. Different witnesses perceive events differently. Different witnesses remember events differently. Different witnesses report events differently. The same witness may give different accounts at different times. Witness accounts may be influenced by trauma, by expectations, by subsequent information, and by various other factors. Yet despite all these limitations, witness testimony remains crucial to understanding historical events. Without witness testimony, we would have no direct access to human experience and perception of events. The pattern of witness accounts considered together may be more meaningful than any individual report. If a large majority of witnesses reported hearing shots from the depository, this suggests that shots came from the depository. If a significant minority of witnesses reported hearing shots from the Grassy Knoll, this suggests that either a second shooter was present, or that the acoustic environment of Dealey Plaza caused confusion about the direction of sound. The pattern of accounts provides information about what witnesses perceived, even if individual accounts are unreliable. The challenge is to interpret the pattern correctly, to distinguish between witnesses who accurately perceived events and witnesses who were confused or mistaken. Witness testimony is essential to understanding what happened, yet its unreliability means that no single account can be definitive. The pattern of accounts considered together may be more meaningful than any individual report. The witnesses to the assassination provide crucial information about what they perceived, but they cannot provide definitive answers about what actually happened. As we move toward a final assessment of what we know about the assassination, we will see how witness testimony, combined with physical evidence, forensic analysis, and declassified documents, contributes to our understanding, while also revealing the limits of what evidence can tell us about historical events. Alternative theories, exploring the possibilities. Witness testimony, while essential, cannot provide definitive answers about the assassination. Over the decades following November 22, 1963, researchers have proposed numerous theories about what actually happened and who was responsible. These theories range from the straightforward that Oswald acted alone to the complex involving multiple conspirators and institutional actors. The proliferation of theories reflects the genuine ambiguities in the evidence and the difficulty of determining historical truth when the evidence admits multiple interpretations. Understanding these alternative theories requires us to examine the motives, the evidence, and the logical consistency of each theory. It also requires us to recognize that the absence of definitive proof does not mean that all theories are equally plausible. The mob theory suggests that organized crime figures, angered by Robert Kennedy's aggressive prosecutions and feeling abandoned after failed Castro plots, orchestrated Kennedy's assassination. This theory has documented motive. Organized crime figures had clear grievances against the Kennedy administration. Sam Giancana, Carlos Marcello, and Jimmy Hoffa all had reasons to want Kennedy dead. The theory also has documented capability. Organized crime had demonstrated the ability to commit murders and to eliminate witnesses. Organized crime had connections to various individuals who might have been involved in the assassination. However, direct evidence linking organized crime to the assassination remains elusive. No declassified documents have provided definitive proof of mob involvement. No credible witness has come forward with direct evidence of mob involvement. The theory relies on circumstantial evidence and on the logical inference that motive and capability suggest involvement. The CIA theory suggests that hardline officials within the agency, frustrated by Kennedy's reluctance to support military action against Cuba and by his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, orchestrated the assassination. This theory has circumstantial support. The CIA had documented interest in removing Castro. The CIA had been humiliated by the Bay of Pigs failure. The CIA had been dismissed from leadership by Kennedy. Allen Dulles, the dismissed CIA director, sat on the Warren Commission itself, creating a potential conflict of interest. However, the CIA theory lacks definitive evidence. No declassified documents have revealed a CIA plot to assassinate Kennedy. No credible witness has come forward with evidence of CIA involvement. The theory relies on the logical inference that institutional interests, and documented frustrations suggest possible involvement. The Cuban theory suggests that either Fidel Castro's government or Cuban exiles opposed to Kennedy's handling of Cuba orchestrated the assassination. The evidence for Cuban government involvement is weak. Castro had motive, but he also had strong reasons to avoid being implicated in Kennedy's death. Declassified Cuban documents suggest that Castro was concerned about being blamed for the assassination. Castro himself denied involvement in interviews conducted decades later. The evidence for Cuban exile involvement is stronger but still circumstantial. Cuban exiles had motive. They had capability. Some Cuban exiles had connections to organized crime and to intelligence agencies. However, no definitive evidence links Cuban exiles to the assassination. The theory relies on circumstantial evidence and logical inference rather than on direct proof. Some theories propose that multiple parties were involved in the assassination. These theories suggest that different groups had motives, and that the assassination resulted from a convergence of interests. Perhaps organized crime and the CIA coordinated their efforts. Perhaps organized crime and Cuban exiles worked together. Perhaps multiple groups, each pursuing their own objectives, independently decided that Kennedy needed to be removed. These theories of multiple conspirators are logistically complex. They require coordination among groups that might not have trusted each other. They require operational security to prevent any of the conspirators from revealing the plot. The more people involved in a conspiracy, the greater the risk that someone will reveal it. Yet the absence of revelation does not prove that a conspiracy did not occur. Conspiracies can remain secret, particularly if those involved are motivated to keep them secret. Other theories propose that Oswald was part of a conspiracy, but did not fire the fatal shot. These theories suggest that Oswald was positioned in the Texas school book depository to provide cover for a second shooter on the Grassy Knoll. Oswald might have fired shots that missed while the second shooter fired the fatal shots. Or Oswald might not have fired any shots at all, simply being present in the depository to provide a convenient suspect. These theories require assuming that Oswald was willing to participate in the assassination of the president. They require assuming that Oswald had connections to conspirators who recruited him. They require assuming that Oswald understood what he was participating in. The evidence for these theories is circumstantial. Oswald's pro-Castro sympathies and his defection to the Soviet Union could suggest connections to various actors, but they do not prove involvement in a conspiracy. Some researchers have proposed that Oswald was a patsy manipulated by others. According to these theories, Oswald was set up to take the fall for the assassination. Oswald was positioned in the depository. Oswald was made to appear suspicious. Oswald was arrested and charged with the assassination. Then Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby before he could testify and reveal that he was being manipulated. These theories require assuming that multiple conspirators coordinated their efforts to frame Oswald and to eliminate him before he could reveal the truth. These theories require assuming a level of coordination and operational security that seems implausible. Yet the fact that Oswald was killed before trial, preventing him from ever testifying about his knowledge or involvement, does lend some plausibility to theories that he was silenced to prevent him from revealing something. Some researchers have proposed that the assassination was a result of Cold War tensions and intelligence operations that spiraled beyond anyone's control. According to these theories, various intelligence agencies and various political actors were pursuing their own objectives regarding Cuba organized crime and Soviet relations. These various operations and objectives intersected in ways that no single actor fully controlled or anticipated. The assassination might have resulted from this convergence of interests and operations rather than from a deliberate conspiracy by any single group. These theories suggest that the assassination was not planned by any single conspirator, but rather emerged from the complex interaction of multiple institutional interests and covert operations. These theories are difficult to prove or disprove because they do not require direct evidence of conspiracy, but rather require understanding the complex interactions of various institutional actors. Each theory has adherents who have devoted years to researching and promoting their particular explanation. Researchers associated with each theory have published books, articles, and documentaries presenting evidence and arguments supporting their theory. Each theory has evidence that supporters cite as supporting their explanation. Each theory also has evidence that critics cite as contradicting or undermining the theory. The debate among proponents of different theories has been vigorous and sometimes acrimonious. Researchers have questioned each other's methodology, their interpretation of evidence, and their objectivity. Yet despite decades of research and debate, no consensus has emerged about which theory is correct. The proliferation of theories reflects the genuine ambiguities in the evidence. The evidence does not point unambiguously to a single explanation. Different pieces of evidence can be interpreted as supporting different theories. The Zapruder film can be interpreted as supporting either the official narrative or the conspiracy theories. The acoustic evidence can be interpreted as supporting either the official narrative or the conspiracy theories. Witness testimony can be interpreted as supporting either the official narrative or the conspiracy theories. The single bullet theory can be interpreted as plausible or implausible depending on one's assumptions about ballistics and human anatomy. The absence of definitive proof of conspiracy can be interpreted as evidence that no conspiracy occurred, or it can be interpreted as evidence that the conspirators were successful in covering up their involvement. The absence of a definitive answer after 60 years suggests that either the truth is genuinely obscure or the evidence that would clarify it remains hidden or was destroyed. If a conspiracy did occur, the conspirators had strong incentives to cover up their involvement. Evidence could have been destroyed. Witnesses could have been intimidated into silence or eliminated. Documents could have been classified and withheld. If no conspiracy occurred, then the absence of evidence of conspiracy is simply the absence of evidence. The difficulty is that we cannot definitively determine which of these scenarios is true. The evidence is consistent with multiple interpretations, and the absence of definitive proof does not allow us to conclude that any particular theory is correct. The proliferation of theories also reflects the human need for understanding and explanation. The assassination of a president is a traumatic event that demands explanation. The official explanation that Oswald acted alone seems inadequate to many people. The idea that a single troubled individual could change the course of history seems implausible to some observers. The idea that powerful institutional actors might have been involved seems more plausible to some observers than the idea that Oswald acted alone. The various conspiracy theories provide alternative explanations that seem more adequate to some people than the official narrative. Whether these theories are correct or not, they reflect genuine questions about the assassination and genuine uncertainties about what actually happened. The challenge of evaluating alternative theories is that it requires distinguishing between plausibility and proof. A theory can be plausible without being proven. A theory can have logical consistency without being true. A theory can have supporting evidence without being definitively established. The mob theory is plausible. Organized crime had motive and capability. But plausibility is not proof. The CIA theory is plausible. The CIA had institutional interests and documented frustrations. But plausibility is not proof. The Cuban theory is plausible. Cuban actors had motive and capability. But plausibility is not proof. The absence of definitive proof does not mean that these theories are false. It means that we cannot definitively establish them as true based on the available evidence. The proliferation of theories reflects the genuine ambiguities in the evidence and the difficulty of determining historical truth when evidence admits multiple interpretations. The absence of a definitive answer after 60 years suggests that either the truth is genuinely obscure or the evidence that would clarify it remains hidden or was destroyed. As we approach the final chapter of this documentary, we will see how the various forms of evidence and analysis contribute to our understanding of the assassination, while also revealing the limits of what we can know about historical events. The Kennedy assassination remains one of the most significant and most mysterious events in American history, a case that continues to fascinate researchers and the public alike. The legacy of doubt, how the assassination changed America. The various theories about the assassination reflect not only disagreements about what happened on November 22, 1963, but also a broader transformation in American society and institutions. The Kennedy assassination occurred at a moment of national confidence and optimism. President Kennedy was popular. The economy was growing. The space program was advancing. America seemed to be winning the Cold War. The nation had a sense of purpose and direction. The sudden death of the president, followed by the mysterious circumstances and the conflicting accounts, shattered that confidence in ways that would reverberate through American society for decades to come. The Warren Commission's conclusion that Oswald acted alone was meant to provide closure and to restore faith in institutions. The Commission hoped that, by providing a definitive answer to the question of who assassinated the president, it would allow the nation to move forward and to heal. However, as documents were declassified and new evidence emerged in the years and decades following the assassination, public trust in the official narrative eroded. The House Select Committee on Assassinations' conclusion in 1979 that a conspiracy was likely contradicted the Warren Commission's finding. Declassified documents revealed that government agencies had withheld information from the Commission. Researchers discovered gaps in the Commission's investigation. The official narrative, which had seemed definitive in 1964, began to seem inadequate and incomplete. Polls conducted in subsequent decades showed that a majority of Americans believed that the assassination involved a conspiracy. In the 1970s, surveys indicated that approximately 80% of Americans believed that a conspiracy was involved in Kennedy's death. This skepticism persisted and even grew in subsequent decades. By the 1990s and 2000s, polls continued to show that a large majority of Americans were skeptical of the official narrative. The American public had lost faith in the Warren Commission's conclusions. The public believed that the government was hiding something about the assassination. Whether this belief was justified or not, it reflected a fundamental shift in public trust in government institutions. This skepticism extended beyond the assassination itself to broader questions about government credibility. The Vietnam War, which escalated in the mid-1960s, raised questions about government honesty. The government had told the public that the war was being won, yet the war continued, and American casualties mounted. The Pentagon Papers released in 1971 revealed that the government had systematically misled the public about the war. The Watergate scandal in the early 1970s revealed that the president himself had engaged in criminal activity and had attempted to cover it up. Revelations about CIA and FBI abuses, including illegal surveillance and assassination plots, deepened public distrust of institutions. The assassination became a symbol of institutional unreliability, a case where the government's official explanation seemed inadequate, and where crucial information appeared to have been withheld. The assassination influenced American culture in profound ways. It became the subject of countless books, films, and documentaries. Researchers devoted entire careers to investigating the case. Oliver Stone's 1991 film JFK brought the assassination conspiracy theories to a mass audience, and sparked renewed public interest in the case. The uncertainty about what actually happened created space for speculation and conspiracy theories. Some of this speculation was grounded in serious research and analysis. Other speculation was fanciful and based on circumstantial evidence or logical leaps. The assassination became a touchstone for American skepticism about official narratives and institutional authority. The assassination marked a transition in American consciousness from a period of relative institutional trust to an era of skepticism and questioning. Before the assassination, Americans generally trusted their government institutions. After the assassination, and particularly after the Vietnam War and Watergate, Americans became much more skeptical of government claims and much more likely to question official narratives. The assassination did not cause this shift in consciousness, but it symbolized it and contributed to it. The uncertainty about what happened on November 22nd, 1963 became emblematic of broader uncertainties about what government institutions were telling the public and what they were hiding. The assassination also influenced how Americans thought about power conspiracy and institutional accountability. The idea that powerful institutions might conspire to commit crimes and to cover them up became more plausible to many Americans after the revelations about Watergate and CIA abuses. The idea that official investigations might be compromised by institutional interests became more credible. The idea that the truth about important historical events might be hidden or distorted became more widely accepted. These shifts in consciousness had implications far beyond the assassination itself. They affected how Americans evaluated government claims about foreign policy, about domestic security, and about other important matters. The assassination also became a subject of cultural fascination and speculation. The mystery of the assassination captured the imagination of writers, filmmakers, and researchers. The case provided material for countless books and films. The assassination became a cultural touchstone, referenced in popular culture and in political discourse. The uncertainty about what actually happened meant that the assassination could be interpreted in different ways by different people. Those who believed in government competence and honesty could accept the official narrative. Those who were skeptical of government could embrace conspiracy theories. The assassination became a kind of cultural mirror, reflecting different Americans' beliefs about power, authority, and truth. Whether the assassination itself caused the shift in American consciousness or merely symbolized broader changes in American society remains debated. Some historians argue that the assassination was a crucial turning point, that it shattered American innocence and confidence in institutions. Other historians argue that the assassination was one of many events that contributed to a broader shift in American consciousness, but that it was not uniquely causative. The Vietnam War, Watergate, and other events also contributed to the erosion of public trust in institutions. The assassination was significant, but it was one element in a larger historical transformation. What is clear is that the assassination had a profound impact on American society and institutions. The uncertainty about what happened created a gap between the official narrative and public belief. This gap has persisted for more than 60 years. The assassination remains a symbol of institutional limits and of the possibility that some truths may remain forever beyond reach. The case has influenced how Americans think about power conspiracy and institutional accountability. The assassination has become embedded in American historical consciousness as a moment when the nation's confidence in its institutions was shaken and never fully restored. The assassination's most significant legacy may not be the uncertainty about what happened on November 22nd, 1963, but rather the lasting impact that uncertainty had on American institutions and public trust. The case remains open, not just as a historical mystery, but as a symbol of institutional limits and the possibility that some truths may remain forever beyond reach. The Kennedy assassination stands as a reminder that historical truth is not always accessible, that evidence can be ambiguous, and that institutions can fail to provide definitive answers to important questions. The case also reminds us that the absence of definitive proof does not necessarily mean that the official narrative is correct. It may mean that the truth is genuinely obscure, or it may mean that the evidence that would clarify it remains hidden or was destroyed. As we approach the conclusion of this documentary, we will reflect on what we have learned about the assassination and what it means that, after more than 60 years, fundamental questions about this pivotal event remain unanswered. 60 years later, what we know and what remains unknown. The assassination's impact on American consciousness and institutions has endured for more than 6 decades. Yet as we approach the present day, we must ask what we have actually learned from all the investigation, research, and analysis. What can we definitively say about the assassination? What fundamental questions remain unanswered? After 60 years of scrutiny, declassified documents, forensic reanalysis, and countless theories, the basic facts of the case remain established. Yet the deeper questions persist. Understanding what we know and what we do not know requires us to distinguish between established facts and contested interpretations, between evidence and speculation. Certain facts are established beyond reasonable doubt. President Kennedy was shot and killed in Dallas on November 27, 1963. The assassination occurred in Dealey Plaza as the presidential motorcade moved through the plaza. Kennedy was struck by bullets and died from his wounds. Governor John Connally was also wounded. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and charged with the crime. Oswald was killed by Jack Ruby before he could stand trial. The Warren Commission concluded that Oswald acted alone in assassinating the president. Subsequent investigations, particularly the House Select Committee on Assassinations, concluded that a conspiracy was likely based on acoustic evidence. Declassified documents have revealed that the FBI and CIA withheld information from the Warren Commission. The physical evidence, the rifle, the shell casings, the autopsy materials, exists and has been extensively analyzed by multiple experts over the decades. Multiple theories have been proposed to explain the assassination. Each theory has supporting evidence that adherents cite. Each theory also has critics who dispute the evidence or the interpretations drawn from it. The mob theory has documented motive and capability, but lacks definitive proof. The CIA theory has circumstantial support, but lacks definitive evidence. The Cuban theory has some supporting evidence, but remains speculative. The theory that Oswald acted alone has support from the Warren Commission and from some subsequent analysts, but it faces challenges from those who question the single bullet theory and who point to witness accounts suggesting a second shooter. The theory that Oswald was part of a conspiracy but did not fire the fatal shot has some supporting evidence, but remains speculative. However, fundamental questions remain unanswered. Did Oswald act alone, or was he part of a conspiracy? This is perhaps the most basic question, and after 60 years it remains contested. If there was a conspiracy, who was involved? Was it organized crime, the CIA, Cuban interests, or some combination of these or other actors? What was Oswald's true allegiance? Was he genuinely committed to communism? Was he working for Cuban intelligence? Was he involved with the CIA, or was he simply a troubled individual with no deep commitment to any ideology or organization? Why did Jack Ruby kill Oswald? Was Ruby acting spontaneously out of emotional response to Kennedy's death, or was he acting on behalf of organized crime or another conspirator? What information was withheld from the Warren Commission, and why some documents remain classified or partially redacted even today? What do these documents contain? Would they provide definitive answers to the questions that have persisted for 60 years? Some of these questions may never be definitively answered. The people directly involved in the assassination are dead. Lee Harvey Oswald is dead. Jack Ruby is dead. President Kennedy is dead. The key figures in the CIA, the FBI, and organized crime who might have had knowledge of a conspiracy are dead. Their direct testimony is no longer available. Documents may have been destroyed. Those who might have destroyed documents are dead and cannot be questioned about what was destroyed or why. Witnesses' memories have faded. The passage of time has made certain investigations impossible. A witness who might have provided crucial testimony in 1963 or 1964 is now dead. A document that might have clarified the truth has been lost or destroyed. Yet the assassination remains one of the most investigated events in history. Researchers continue to examine the evidence, propose new theories, and search for previously unknown documents. The JFK Assassination Records Review Board has released millions of pages of documents over the past decades. Researchers have used these documents to construct more complete pictures of government activities in the years before the assassination. Researchers have used modern forensic techniques to reanalyze physical evidence. Researchers have conducted interviews with aging witnesses and with the families of deceased witnesses. The investigation continues even as the passage of time makes certain forms of investigation impossible. The case embodies both the power and the limits of historical investigation. The power lies in the ability to gather vast amounts of information. Researchers have access to the Zapruder film, the autopsy materials, the ballistics evidence, witness testimony, declassified documents, and countless other sources of information. Researchers have used sophisticated technology to analyze this evidence. Computer modeling, digital enhancement, acoustic analysis, and forensic pathology have all been brought to bear on the assassination evidence. The amount of information available about the assassination is extraordinary. Few historical events have been examined so thoroughly, yet the limits of historical investigation are also evident. Despite all this information and all this analysis, fundamental questions remain unanswered. The evidence admits multiple interpretations. Different experts examining the same evidence reach different conclusions. The absence of definitive proof does not mean that the official narrative is correct. It may mean that the truth is genuinely obscure, or it may mean that the evidence that would clarify it remains hidden or was destroyed. Historical investigation can gather information, but it cannot always achieve absolute certainty about what happened. The Kennedy assassination endures as a historical mystery, not because evidence is lacking, but because the available evidence admits multiple interpretations. Researchers have examined the evidence from every conceivable angle, yet the evidence remains ambiguous. The Zapruder film can be interpreted as supporting either the official narrative or the conspiracy theories. The autopsy materials can be interpreted as supporting either conclusion. The witness testimony is contradictory. The physical evidence is subject to different interpretations depending on one's assumptions about ballistics, human anatomy, and the behavior of bullets. The acoustic evidence is contested. The declassified documents reveal gaps in the Warren Commission's investigation, but do not definitively prove that a conspiracy occurred. What we can say with confidence is that the assassination was a pivotal moment in American history. The assassination marked a turning point in American consciousness. It shattered national confidence in institutions. It raised questions about government credibility that have persisted for 60 years. It became a symbol of institutional limits and of the possibility that some truths may remain forever beyond reach. The assassination influenced American culture, politics, and historical consciousness in profound ways. We can also say with confidence that the Warren Commission's investigation was incomplete. The Commission operated with incomplete information. Government agencies withheld information from the Commission. The Commission did not thoroughly investigate certain areas. The Commission's conclusions were shaped not only by evidence, but also by institutional interests and political considerations. A more thorough investigation with access to all available information might have reached different conclusions. We can say that multiple theories about the assassination have some supporting evidence. The mob theory has documented motive and capability. The CIA theory has circumstantial support. The Cuban theory has some supporting evidence. The theory that Oswald acted alone has support from some analysts, but faces challenges from others. None of these theories has been definitively proven or definitively disproven. What remains unclear is which of these theories is correct. The evidence does not point unambiguously to a single explanation. The case remains open, not because evidence is lacking, but because the available evidence admits multiple interpretations. After 60 years of investigation, the fundamental questions about the assassination remain contested. Different researchers examining the same evidence reach different conclusions based on their assumptions and interpretive frameworks. The Kennedy assassination reminds us that history is not always a story with a clear resolution. Some historical events remain mysterious despite extensive investigation. Some truths may remain perpetually contested. The case also reminds us of the importance of institutional accountability and transparency. The withholding of information from investigators, the gaps in official investigations, and the classified documents that remain hidden, even today, all suggest that institutions do not always operate in the public interest. The assassination has become a symbol of these institutional failures and of the importance of demanding transparency and accountability from government institutions. Over the past 3 hours, we've journeyed through one of the most significant and most contested events in modern American history. We've examined the assassination itself, those crucial seconds in Dealey Plaza on November 20, 1963. We've explored Lee Harvey Oswald's enigmatic background, the Warren Commission's investigation, and the controversial conclusions that emerged from that official inquiry. We've considered the physical evidence, the rifle, the shell casings, the Zapruder film, the autopsy materials, and how modern forensic analysis has attempted to clarify questions that remain. We've examined the various theories that researchers have proposed over the decades: the mob theory, the CIA theory, the Cuban theory, and others. We've looked at what declassified documents have revealed about government activities and institutional interests. We've considered witness testimony and its inherent unreliability. We've reflected on Jack Ruby's killing of Oswald on the Grassy Knoll and the second shooter theory on acoustic evidence and computer modeling. What emerges from this exploration is not a definitive answer to the question of what happened on November 22, 1963, but rather a deeper understanding of the complexity of historical investigation and the genuine ambiguities that can persist even after decades of scrutiny. The Kennedy assassination matters not only because it was a pivotal moment in American history, but because it reveals something fundamental about how we understand the past and how institutions operate. The assassination shattered American confidence in government institutions at a crucial moment. It raised questions about government credibility that have persisted for more than 60 years. It became a symbol of institutional limits, a reminder that some truths may remain forever beyond reach, that evidence can be ambiguous, and that the official narrative is not always complete or reliable. The case demonstrates both the power and the limits of historical investigation. We can gather vast amounts of information. We can analyze evidence with sophisticated technology. We can interview witnesses and examine declassified documents. Yet despite all this, fundamental questions can remain contested. Different experts examining the same evidence can reach different conclusions based on their assumptions and interpretive frameworks. The assassination reminds us that history is not always a story with a clear resolution. Some historical events remain mysterious, despite extensive investigation. Some truths may remain perpetually contested. The enduring mystery of the Kennedy assassination also reflects something important about human nature and our relationship to history. We are drawn to mysteries. We want to understand what happened. We want to know the truth. When official explanations seem inadequate, we seek alternative explanations. When institutions withhold information, we become skeptical. When evidence is ambiguous, we interpret it through the lens of our own beliefs and assumptions. The Kennedy assassination has become a cultural touchstone precisely because it embodies these universal human experiences. The case continues to fascinate researchers and the public alike because it raises fundamental questions about power, about conspiracy, about institutional accountability, and about the search for truth in a complex world. The assassination reminds us that history is not static. New documents continue to be declassified. New research continues to emerge. New technologies allow us to reanalyze old evidence. The investigation into the Kennedy assassination is not finished. It may never be finished. Yet the ongoing investigation itself is valuable. It keeps us engaged with history. It reminds us to question official narratives. It demonstrates the importance of demanding transparency and accountability from institutions. What studying the Kennedy assassination gives us is not necessarily definitive answers about what happened on November 22, 1963. Rather, it gives us a deeper understanding of how to think about history, how to evaluate evidence, how to distinguish between plausibility and proof, and how to hold institutions accountable. The case teaches us humility about what we can know. It teaches us to be skeptical of official narratives without descending into unfounded speculation. It teaches us that the absence of definitive proof does not necessarily mean that the official explanation is correct. It teaches us that institutions can fail, that information can be withheld, and that the search for truth is ongoing and never fully complete. The Kennedy assassination endures as a historical mystery, not because evidence is lacking, but because the available evidence admits multiple interpretations. The case reminds us that history is complex, that truth can be elusive, and that some of the most important events in our past may never be fully understood. Thank you for joining this journey through one of history's great mysteries. We've explored the evidence together, considered different perspectives, and acknowledged the genuine uncertainties that remain. Whether you found answers to your questions or simply gained a deeper appreciation for the complexity of historical investigation, I hope this exploration has been worthwhile. The Kennedy assassination will continue to fascinate researchers and the public alike. New documents may yet be declassified. New research may yet emerge. The case may never be fully resolved. But the ongoing search for truth, the continued questioning of official narratives, and the commitment to understanding our history, these are valuable in themselves. Rest well, knowing that you've engaged with one of the most significant and most mysterious events in American history. Good night.